The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 101 Scanning Goods. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Jenny is reporting to Madame Sophie what Archduke Franz did during the day. Mrs. Sophie frowned when she heard this. This prestigious violet seemed to be nothing special. She couldn't even handle it as a child, so she spent so much time training her in vain. In fact, Jenny also felt that she was wronged. She thought she was very good at tracking and searching, but the little Grand Duke seemed to know that she was being followed and actually called a horse. No matter how good she was at tracking, she only had 2 legs, so there was no way she could keep up with the horses, so she had to give up. In desperation, Jenny had to try her luck in Franz's bedroom. She successfully found 3 secret passages and a storage room that had been sealed for at least several decades, but these were not what Mrs. Sophie wanted. Mrs. Sophie just wanted to know what Franz had done recently. If there was anything she felt was inappropriate, she could intervene in time. Also, she wanted to know where the money Jenny mentioned was. If such a large sum of money is not kept properly, it will be remembered sooner or later. Instead of giving it an advantage to others, it is better to leave it to her as a mother for safekeeping. Franz was actually very interested in this beautiful female attendant, but he also knew that she was sent by Mrs. Sophie to keep an eye on him. After all, it is difficult to stop a mother's controlling desire. Historically, Mrs. Sophie interfered in national politics several times due to her excessive desire for control. Even after Franz ascended the throne, he still affected the political situation. Due to the limitations of political vision, the Austrian Empire made several wrong decisions. In the end, Austria was isolated and helpless in the Austro-Prussian War. Her second son, Maximilian, died in Mexico. She also passed away in extreme pain and self-blame. In this life, Franz told Mrs. Sophie a lot of bedtime stories. Although it broadened her horizons, nature is hard to change, and she still wanted to keep Franz in her hands. Franz is not a real child, so how can he accept the control of others? At the same time, under strict control, Franz could do very little. If Franz is really just content to be a bystander of history, then he will just sit back and wait for the arrival of the spring storm of all nations. But that would be too disrespectful to his status as a time traveler, and who can guarantee that the rioters will not rush into the palace and exterminate the Habsburg family in this life? Franz often listened to Thalia, read the newspapers, and the most common ones she heard about were assassinations of important people. There are several very bad assassinations in the Austrian Empire every month. Some are because of money, some are because of hatred, some are because of lovers, separatists, anarchists, and some even just want to prove that there is no one else in the world but he himself. Even more celebrities were assassinated in this era, including but not limited to the imaginative Lincoln, the pretentious Princess Sissy, a Cubotish Imici whose head was mistaken for a football, and the first roller coaster passenger Tsar in human history, Alexander I. Franz didn't want to have his name added to the list, so he chose to be the master of his fate, rather than leave it to chance. Vienna, National Trading Center. Baron Bruck made a high-profile appearance at the Vienna Trading Center, which immediately attracted the attention of many bankers and speculators. After all, this is the investment advisor of the royal family, and his choice is very likely to be the choice of the royal family, and his operations in the 2 transactions of American land and Austrian railways are enough to make him famous in history. Although it was Archduke Franz Karol who was sweeping the goods that day, no smart person would believe that a fool could control the entire Austrian financial world. As for the speculation of land in the United States, naturally it cannot be concealed. You must know that the profit in Chicago alone was 50 times. Although it was not sold at the highest point, it was a miracle in the eyes of investors in the industry. Along with Baron Bruck, there were also a large number of well-known Viennese wealthy and upper-class people, as well as bankers and famous speculators. Baron Bruck invited almost all potential investors in Vienna. He publicly announced that he would hoard food, because neither the people nor the country can do without food, and the European continent cannot have a bumper harvest every year. Now is a good time to purchase food. However, this idea is not new at all. Countless people have tried it before, and they all lost their money and left with regrets, and due to the opening of the German customs union, Prussian grain actually entered Austria in the opposite direction. Now there is more grain on the Austrian market than can be purchased, and some grain producing areas have begun to reduce production. To control prices and costs, the crowd of onlookers suddenly decreased by half. Most of the remaining people were just giving Baron Brook face, and their thoughts had already flown elsewhere. Baron Brook spent 1,000,000 florins on the spot to buy wheat. 1,000,000 florins was a lot, but in the entire market, there was no way to make any waves. Except for a very small number of people, no one followed the investment. Every day after that, Baron Brook would go to the trading center and place an order for 1,000,000 florins. This kind of order was usually only enough for a big businessman, so someone would be willing to provide Baron Brook with a discount. This situation continued until the 7th day. Baron Brook had no money, but fortunately Mrs. Sophie entered the house in time. In fact, Mrs. Sophie was very puzzled by this crazy behavior, but his Franz had never let her down, and she believed that Baron Brook's professional level would never be swayed by a child. However, Madame Sophie and Archduke Franz Karol did not actually have much liquidity, so they scraped together to come up with 1,000,000 florins on the 8th day. The Taffy family of Moravia entered the scene. As a big tycoon in Moravia, the financial resources of the Taffy family cannot be underestimated. Edward Taffy's father Thomas Taff came to Vienna with 3 million. He received the news a month ago. At first he was a little unbelievable, but he still decided to take a gamble. At this time, the price of grain in Austria finally began to rise, because almost all the spot goods had been purchased, and the inventory had dropped to a dangerous value. The abnormal fluctuations in grain prices caught the attention of Solomon Rothschild. He felt that this was a good opportunity for revenge, because the grain mortgages he had received due to debt problems over the years had piled up. As long as he takes action now, he can immediately suppress the price of food to the previous price, or even lower than before. In this way, Solomon not only solved the backlog of inventory, but also allowed funds to flow back. This was no reason for him to refuse after suffering heavy losses in the railway transaction. So Solomon Rothschild sold the spot goods in his hands twice, once again bringing the price of grain in the Austrian Empire back to its original position. Just as Solomon was celebrating his successful revenge, a heavyweight player from the royal family appeared on the stage. As the richest nobleman in Austria, Archduke Karol's every move received extra attention. In the end, Archduke Karol placed a huge order of 15,000,000 florins, which directly ignited the grain trading market. For a time, a large number of speculators poured in and almost wiped out Austria's grain stocks. The Austrian grain trade is booming. As a good neighbor of Austria, how can the Prussians miss this good opportunity to throw cold water on it? Chapter 102, Ruling the World with the Common People. Franz was very grateful for Archduke Karol's rescue, because he did not expect that Solomon Rothschild would suddenly come out to disrupt the situation. Solomon Rothschild's behavior seemed to be just a normal transaction, but he was very likely to cause the bankruptcy of Franz's entire plan. Franz's purpose is not just to make money, he also wants more. In fact, what Franz didn't know was that his anonymous letter never reached the hands of Archduke Karol, and Baron Brook's lobbying had no effect. The letter was withheld by Archduke Karol's steward. Archduke Karol had no interest in making money at all. He had previously purchased railways because he felt that this was a strategic resource and should be nationalized. In the eyes of the royal family in this era, what belongs to the royal family belongs to the country. It was Archduke Friedrich who really made Archduke Karol decide to invest in food. Failure quietly found Friedrich and asked him for help. Although Friedrich spent money lavishly, it was just for eating, drinking and having fun. For such large transactions that easily cost millions, he could only ask his father for help. Archduke Karol liked his third son very much. The eldest son was too stubborn, the second son was too weak, and the fourth son was weak and sick. Only the third son could please him the most. But in fact, Friedrich did not like his father at all, because Archduke Karol was very strict, especially after his mother's death. Archduke Karol became even more strict. So Friedrich chose the navy and completely left Archduke Karol's sight. There is a saying that distance brings beauty. Because he was far away from Archduke Karol's sight, Archduke Karol became particularly close to him. Friedrich had his own way to deal with the stubborn Archduke Karol, and that was to approach it from a military perspective. The greatest losses in the Napoleonic Wars were Austria and Spain. Austria lost 550,000 people, 250,000 of whom starved to death. Spain lost 590,000 people, 280,000 of whom died from famine. Why did Napoleon defeat Moscow? Isn't it because there are no supplies? This shows how important food is to a country. Although the words are a bit rough, the reasoning is not rough. Archduke Karol immediately realized the seriousness of the problem. In order to deal with the possible crisis, he not only had to purchase enough grain, but also stopped selling grain in all the manors under his name. Archduke Karol's sense of crisis and some operations directly raised the price of food to a higher level. Berlin City Palace. William III sat proudly on the throne. After the formal establishment of the German customs union, Prussia's economy developed in an all-round way. Due to the clever restrictions on the railway, Prussia's position in North Germany became more stable. But what makes him happiest is that the crops on his territory have been sold at good prices, and even the previously accumulated inventory has been sold out. I heard that the Austrians were raising the price of food. They were crazy, said Prime Minister Karl von Wielich. This is an opportunity for us, which allows us to completely defeat the Hungarians. The purchasing power of the Austrians is stronger than that of the entire North Germany, and we cannot lose this market, said the new finance minister Friedrich List. Now that Friedrich List had become the spokesman for the Junker landowners, he naturally had to speak for his new masters. Prussian grain could be sold to Austria, which the Prussian Junker landowners had never dreamed of. Of course, this was thanks to the assistance of the Hungarians, who insisted on imposing high tariffs on Austria, and at the same time, did not allow Austria to build a railway to Hungary. Although this maintained the distance between Hungary and Austria, it caused heavy economic losses. The poor did not have such strong patriotism. They only knew what was cheap and what could fill their stomachs. Moreover, the slogan that Hungary has been trying its best to promote, that they are not Austrians, worked at this time. The Austrians gave up Hungarian food and switched to cheaper Prussian food without feeling any guilt. But Prime Minister Karl von Wielich said with some worry, now, our food supply in Prussia has bottomed out. If we continue to sell food to the Austrians, we can certainly make profits. But what should we do if there is a natural disaster? William III deeply believed in Wielich's words. When he was a child, he experienced the Napoleonic War, and Berlin was starved to death by natural and man-made disasters. He saw that terrible scene, and still remembers it fresh. I think Mr. Wielich is right, said William III. So, what? We can buy grain from Russia. The price of Russian grain is lower than ours. The reason why the purchase of Russian grain has been banned is to protect the interests of its own citizens. If there is a famine caused by natural disasters, we can definitely buy grain from Russia. Buy food to survive the crisis, said Friedrich List. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia was the son-in-law of William III. He also helped his son-in-law suppress the Polish uprising. Compared with him, this son-in-law must be grateful to him. Even if a natural disaster happened, as long as he opened his mouth, I believed that this son-in-law would definitely help. William III felt that what Friedrich List said made sense. Mr. Lister is right, Your Majesty. The fate of Prussia should not be in the hands of others. We must stop selling food to Austria and leave enough food for Prussia. Otherwise, once the Russians betray their trust, the entire country will fall into turmoil. Wielich said. Mr. Wielich, are you trying to sow discord between His Majesty and his family? The country is in turmoil? What a joke. Are our Prussian troops of 200,000 just decorations? Friedrich List asked rhetorically. Nicholas is His Majesty's son-in-law, but he is also the Tsar of Russia. Wielich emphasized. Will the Russian Tsar sit back and watch Prussia decline and Austria's influence in the German Confederation increase? Don't forget that Russia and Austria are competing in the Balkans. They both hope to take the legacy of the Ottoman Empire into their pockets. There can only be a strong Prussia. Can we contain Austria and prevent it from advancing eastward? Friedrich List said impassionately. What about the civilians? Even if the Russians are willing to sell grain to us, it is doubtful whether the civilians can afford it. What if people starve to death? Wilich asked. People starve to death? Don't people starve to death in good times? Mr. Wilich, you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and you know very little about civilians. And I was born a civilian, and now no matter where I'm in any city in any country, people are hungry. This situation has existed for at least thousands of years, but are the civilians extinct? Asked Friedrich List, but Wilich wanted to say something else, but was interrupted by Friedrich List. Your Majesty rules the world with the nobles, not with the common people. Mr. Lister is right, said William III. Chapter 103 Poison King Victoria. This is the best of times, it's the worst of times. 4. Britain. It was the golden age, the pinnacle of the colonial rule of the British Empire, and the sunset never sets imperial period, that the British Miss Britain was the first to complete the Industrial Revolution, and its reputation as the world's factory is true. Point. The British naval strength was incomprehensible in the eyes of Europeans at that time. Even if the entire European navy was organized into a fleet, the British would still be able to sink it. This is the best evaluation of British naval strength. Point. For Britain's middle and upper classes, they can say so with pride. The plains of North America and Russia are our cornfields, Chicago and Odessa are our granaries, Canada and the Baltic Sea are our forest farms, Australia and Western Asia have our sheeplands, Argentina and the western grasslands of North America have our cattle. Peru brings its silver, South Africa and Australia's gold flows to London, the Indians and the Chinese grew our tea, our coffee, sugar cane, and spice plantations spread throughout the Indies. Spain and France are our vineyards, the Mediterranean is our orchards, and our coffee, which has long grown in the American South. Cotton fields are expanding to all warm areas of the earth. If you are a big noble or a big businessman, you can spend all day drinking and drinking, occasionally meeting up with a few friends, and taking dozens of hounds with you to hunt at your friend's hunting ground. Point. If you are a middle-level person, such as a lawyer, civil servant, mid-level military officer, pastor, etc., this is an era where you can see the future. Point. Marry a wife who is decades older than you. Hire a maid, rent a room in the city, have a few children, and put them through high school. Although life is difficult, you can have a decent life. Point. For the lower class people in the UK, things are not so good. With a workload of 18 hours a day, you may get involved in the machine. If you are not careful. Point. If you are lucky enough to survive, you will be sent to the workhouse to die, usually due to wound infection, cold, pneumonia, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, etc. Of course, it may also be because you are forgotten and starved to death. Die. Point. Even if you are born with supernatural powers and can always maintain vigorous experiences and will not die from fatigue, the poisonous smoke and wastewater in factories and cities will still make you sick. Point. Doctors in this era usually choose to bleed you. If the bloodletting is ineffective, they will consider amputating a certain part of your body until you cannot afford the consultation fee or die. Point. You don't want to die inactive like this. You remember what Bacon said, knowledge is power. However, you find that you have no time to study at all. You have to work 18 hours a day. If you don't work, you won't have food. Point. Fortunately, you have unlimited energy, and you can study in the few hours when others are taking a rest. When you feel that you are already a talent, you went to take the British Civil Service examination, but the people in the examination room refused to let you in. Because you have no fixed assets. If you travel through time and become a child, congratulations, you no longer have to worry about finding a job. You can start working at the age of 6 or 7. Digging chimneys and working in coal mines were popular occupations for children at that time. As long as you did hard labor for 12 hours a day in a small, cramped and dirty space, you could get 5 pence. How about that? Fair enough. Point. If you don't want to work, you are usually sent to an orphanage by your parents. You will see a group of fat managers eating a banquet on one side, and there is only half a sprouted potato in your bowl. Point. Even so, half of your potato will have to be bitten by the boss first. As for how much the boss bites, it all depends on the mood of the boss. If you dare to resist, you will be beaten severely. If you are unlucky, you will most likely die in the orphanage. in the courtyard. Your roommates will steal your clothes and shoes, so that you can truly come naked and leave naked without taking away half of the clouds. I don't know whether the lower class people in the UK will puff up their chests with confidence when they think of the industry and wealth of the British Empire but I think they must really want to say fuck. Bloody hell for the Irish, Boers, Afghans, people from the two ancient civilizations in the East, and the millions of people exploited by British colonization. It was a worse era. It is true that the British do not smoke opium, but when they drink opium soup, they have a cup of opium soup, which makes them suffer from headaches and brain heat, a cup of backache and leg pain, and their bodies are hollowed out. Have a drink. The child is crying and refuses to eat. Have a drink. There are indeed several countries on the European continent that ban their citizens from smoking opium, but they care more about the outflow of gold and silver than their citizens' bodies. The Poison King once condemned opium, but he did not ban it at the legal level. Even the condemnation was done in private. The Poison King indeed witnessed the glory of the British Empire. At the same time, she signed an evil document and used 2 wars to knock on the door of the ancient country and spread the poison of opium to the world. At this time, the main force of drug trafficking for the Poison King was the Jews. The streets and alleys of Europe were full of Jews selling opium and wine. This group of people made huge profits by poisoning the people. This group of people really deserved to die. Several Jewish families in the East contributed millions of pounds in taxes to the British government every year. Among them was the Sassoon family, which accounted for half of the opium trade and poisoned tens of millions of people in his life. As a result, no one knew about his sins and got a good death. David Sassoon was originally a magistrate in the Ottoman Empire. To escape the persecution of anti-Semites, his family fled to Bombay, where he bought a British citizenship and began his life of cheating. When the first box of opium arrived in the eastern continent, gold flew in like snowflakes. In just a few years, David Sassoon made money that his ancestors had not been able to make for generations. There was once an upright official who destroyed his opium, and he united all the opium dealers on the ocean to submit to the British, but this was not enough to convince the British. So he found his in-laws, who were also the biggest sponsors behind him, the Rothschild family. After paying a large sum of money, the British finally decided to send troops. After that, Sassoon's business went smoothly without any hindrance. It even earned him the title of Little Emperor of Bombay, as his family was also known. The Rothschild of the East is worshipped by the Jews. Franz didn't like opium, let alone these opium dealers, and he decided to do something. The problem in Vienna was easy to solve. After all, the emperor's imperial edict could even ban smoking, let alone opium. Historically, Vienna was the first city in the world to ban smoking. The reason was that the emperor believed a prophecy that a smoker will capture Vienna. We need to think of a solution to the problem in Austria, but as for matters in Asia, we can only leave it to the church. After all, for religious fanatics, there is simply no greater honor than the destruction of evil pagans. Franz is also very willing to see the evil people get retribution. As for procedural justice, Franz is not the virgin. As long as the evil people can get the punishment they deserve, why should they care about the means? I thought about it, and I think that my book is for others to read, but it is also for me to read, and it is also an explanation for the readers who have been reading it. I have cut nearly 50 chapters and magically changed several plots. Apart from making some loyal readers find it incomprehensible, it has no value. Therefore, this book will be written according to the original rhythm. If you don't want to read it, you can leave. Chapter 104 Hell Drawing. Vienna, Turnstress. This is a border area of Vienna, with a bustling town on one side and a slum on the other. This is also the place where opium and wine are most rampant, because people here have no hope, but they need entertainment. They cannot afford to go to high-end places such as pubs, cafes, and brothels, but they can buy a glass of low-quality opium wine for only 5 pfennigs. They can afford it. Unlike the lucrative Eastern opium trade, the opium trade strategy on the European continent at this time was to make small profits, but quick turnover. Opium wine was packaged as a British product. Because of the power of Britain, Europeans in this era always looked down upon British products. As a result, this cheap and fashionable way of leisure quickly spread in the slums. The streets were full of drunkards who had hallucinations due to drinking opium wine. Some people also suffered from lifelong disabilities and mental illness due to excessive consumption of opium wine. A disordered monster, the anger in Archbishop Roche's chest was ignited. However, just opposite this hellish scene was a row of luxury carriages. The upper class people in the car were invited by Archbishop Roche to see hell on earth. However, here, they seemed to have really seen hell. After witnessing everything in front of them, they all believed that hell was real. Especially those noble ladies and rich ladies who grew up in boudoir. They almost fainted from fright. There were even a few strong-blooded gentlemen who, after learning that all this was thanks to the Jewish opium wine, ignited the anger in their hearts and wanted to kill those damn poisonous wine dealers immediately. Of course, there were a few who were blind and tried to make fun of the poor, but without exception, they were severely reprimanded. The only reason to blame is that their sense of humor came from the wrong place. In fact, the most angry person was Archbishop Roche himself. As the organizer of this event, as an archbishop, he really could not imagine that such a hell on earth existed in his own diocese. Just now he had cursed the wine dealers who sold opium wine, but he was still angry, so he had to vent his anger on the nobles, who did not take the opportunity to make fun of them. Archbishop Roche did not expect that opium wine was so harmful and spread so widely. Just before, he thought that Archduke Franz was alarmist. Now he believes that this kind of thing is definitely the enemy of God and must be eliminated. In fact, the victims these upper class people saw were actually a group of actors pretending to be victims. They were found by a Janny. These gypsies who have been wandering around Europe all year round are a group of natural actors due to European stereotypes. As long as a little makeup is used, it can be fake and real. Franz is not a person who likes to lie, but popularizing science takes too long, and it is far from the impact of seeing it with his own eyes. Franz did not leave this matter to Thalia. Although she was smart, she was not careful enough. And she really followed her ideas and hired a group of real actors. Then it is very possible to directly join the gang. After all, no one can guarantee that there will be no groupies in the upper class. It is more appropriate to leave this kind of matter to a Janny, although she always feels that she is an agent or a spy. But in Franz's eyes, she was a liar, let a liar plan a scam, and it will naturally be a professional counterpart and seamless. And a Janny had just become Franz's attendant, and she also wanted to express herself. Another good thing about using gypsies is that no one will believe them. Even if someone later discovers that this is a scam, these gypsies are willing to be witnesses, and no one will believe them. After this party, many upper class people became anti-drug fighters, especially when these fighters combined opium wine and Jews. Their combat effectiveness immediately doubled. However, Vienna's drug traffickers were not without any resistance. On the same day he watched the drawing of hell, Solomon Rothschild got the news that the church was going to unite the upper class to take action against their opium industry. Damn. Greedy pigs. Why can they sell holy water and indulgences? This is naked jealousy. Solomon Rothschild didn't know anything about opium. He only knew about his family's partners in the East, who used it to obtain violence, so he wanted to try it. Solomon was not afraid of the church's actions. He only thought it was a small setback and a small trick in the long-term war between the church and the Jews. But Solomon Rothschild was a cautious man. He believed that a lion can fight a rabbit with all his strength, so he immediately used his power within the palace, hoping to create a double insurance to prevent opium and wine from being banned. Taste. Vienna, Hall of Mirrors. My stupid brother, isn't this wine to your liking? My poor brother, if it is medicine disguised as wine, will you drink it? My stupid brother, don't you know about medicinal wine? My poor brother, the candy is filled with shit, will you eat it? Archduke Franz Karol looked very angry. In fact, when Franz was explaining it to his father, Archduke Franz Karol expressed great indignation at the practice of disguising medicine as wine. This was of course because Archduke Franz Karol liked it too much and don't like medicine. Archduke Franz Karol felt that disguising medicine as wine would be an insult to wine, so he readily agreed to Franz's request. At this time, Archbishop Roche on the side quickly came out to smooth things over. Your Majesty, according to our church's research, this drug has strong hallucinogenic and addictive properties. Some people are addicted to the pleasure brought by the drug, which is the greatest blasphemy against God. Ferdinand I nodded. In fact, he didn't care about opium, but he really couldn't agree with his stupid brother's sugar-coated shit theory. Your Excellency, how harmful is this drug? In fact, Ferdinand I also knew something about opium. This was what Ferdinand I's chief advisor told him. Of course, Karl von Sloth only the benefits of opium were mentioned, but not a word was mentioned about its harm. Karl von Sloot received a bribe just a few days ago. This was the first bribe he had received since taking office. He decided to build a good reputation and win repeat customers, so he spent the night educating Queen Anna of Ferdinand I about the benefits of opium, such as relieving pain, reducing fever, treating dysentery, etc. In order to let Queen Anna better experience this good, he and Queen Anna also drank some opium liquor. Archbishop Prussia was well prepared for what Ferdinand I said. Your Majesty, do you remember Captain Charmany, Ferdinand? I immediately remembered the giant bear-like figure. He was once a member of the Imperial Guard, but was expelled from the Imperial Guard by Ferdinand I because of his affair with Queen Anna. Remember? Why did you mention that scumbag, Archbishop? Prussia answered fearfully, and then had a shriveled old man brought in. His huge frame was covered with a thin layer of flesh. His eyes were looking at the dome blankly, and his body exuded an unpleasant odor. Your Majesty, he has suffered the punishment he deserves. After Captain Charmany was expelled from the palace, the huge contrast in his life made him addicted to the short-term pleasure brought by opium wine. For this reason, he sold his ancestral property, he gave up his dignity, and now he has become a zombie. Ferdinand I tried to sit up as straight as he could. He wanted to see if it was Captain Charmany. Ferdinand I saw clearly that it was Captain Charmany, but Captain Charmany's eyes had lost focus, as if he were a real walking corpse. Ferdinand I sighed. It's a terrible poison. Just do as you say. Any sale and promotion of opium food is illegal. This is my royal decree. Ferdinand I. Karl von Sloot also knew Captain Charmany. Seeing his current appearance, Sloot was frightened and could not help but curse those Jewish profiteers from the bottom of his heart. Thanks to Emperor Justinian for the reward and the book Friend Sleeping Cat Wind, Rain, and Thunder. Reader 1248520516666310656. Function word selection. Night supper sang. Kalak. The festival is trembling. TPC. I'm an old bookworm. Book friends. 2019070621222657 Z monthly tickets for Yeo Muge, Zhu Feng Shaonian, Fangpian, Justinian the Great, Fuya Xiangxiang, Shangsuya Lexi, and the support of all readers. Please vote and comment. Chapter 105 Violet's Troubles. Mexico. The naval battle that Friedrich longed for did not happen. The American cruiser that was supposed to intercept the Austrian fleet was stopped by the French fleet. The reason is simple. The French feel that Americans want to be pirates, just like their former mother country Britain. From the perspective of the French, who have been bullied by English pirates, they will never allow another pirate who can harm them to appear on the ocean. If the Americans really robbed the Austrian fleet, and those weapons and equipment fell into the hands of the Americans, wouldn't those Americans use these equipment to come back and attack Texas? As for the man behind the scenes, of course it is Franz. Although the number of ships in the Austrian Navy fleet is far greater than the number of cruisers that the US Navy may send, no one can guarantee that the Austrian Navy will definitely win. But there are many ways to remain undefeated, such as avoiding this conflict. As long as the French are informed of their interests, they will definitely choose to stop the Americans. The Americans were also helpless. Although the performance of their warships was better than that of the French, they were not comparable in terms of numbers, and if you offend the French at this time, it will not be a wise move for the Americans, who are suffering from internal and external troubles at this time. As for the Mexican Navy, those light gunboats are just a bunch of toy ships to the Austrian Navy, and are not a concern at all. The Mexican Navy does not have any kamikaze tradition, but the speed of this rebellion is really incredible. When Friedrich's naval fleet sailed into the port, the Mexican Navy had already changed their flags and lined up to greet them. Being unable to surrender in Mexico is not a shame, but a necessary skill for every soldier. The person who received Friedrich at the port was a dark and thin young man. It is said that this young man's name was Jimmy. He came from Texas and was a ruthless man who was not afraid of death. But Friedrich was very interested in the young man in front of him. No interest whatsoever. Friedrich wanted to know where the payment was. The Mexicans kept their promise, 20 million francs and 10 million Mexican pesos. However, the silver mine promised to be mined by the Austrians for 10 years was still in the hands of the rebels. Friedrich was very satisfied with this transaction. To be honest, he thought the Mexicans would just deal with it and leave. In fact, if it were in the past, Tazinana would definitely do this. But this man who regarded Archduke Franz Karol as his confidant would not treat his Austrian ally like this. Jimmy was very satisfied with the weapons, because the Austrians did not play tricks on them to reduce the number of weapons. Although these equipments are all eliminated by Austria, they are enough to kill everyone on this American continent. What made Jimmy overjoyed was the military supplies and food. Due to the bottomless destruction of both sides in the Civil War, northern Mexico had almost no harvest. If there is no food, no matter how many weapons you have, it will be useless at this time. The Mexican officers who came with Jimmy also sincerely admired the legendary Archduke Franz Karol. Although Tazinana likes to think of himself as Napoleon, his subordinates all know how bad he is. In fact, these people did not have much hope for Archduke Franz Karol, whom Tazinana highly respected, because according to the two Austrian generals, the Archduke's mind did not seem to be very bright, but this time they were convinced. If Tazinana can win this war in the end, then these military supplies must be indispensable, even more important than those rifles and cannons. This successful transaction will allow the Austrian army to update some new equipment, and the navy will also receive new funding. Friedrich felt that with the new funding and his father's support, he would be able to build a batch of his own warships. But what Friedrich didn't know was that Archduke Karol had already spent all the remaining money at home on railways and grain. Of course, this mission must be described as more dangerous, so as to better convince the old D-heads in the army. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Jenny knows that if she wants to truly get close to Franz, she must first gain Franz's trust. The first step she had to take was to please the child in front of her. She had always felt that she was very popular with the child, but this time she hit a wall. What are your specialties, Miss Jenny? I'm good at anything, Jenny answered confidently. That means I have no special skills. Franz wrote down in a notebook that he had no special skills. Jenny wanted to start with Franz's studies, but she soon found that her brain was not enough. Fortunately, she gave up in time. Jenny re-evaluated her abilities. She felt that she was definitely not as good as Franz in natural sciences and mathematics, but Jenny is still very confident in her language talent. She knows 4 foreign languages, and she will definitely be able to show her skills in front of this child. However, this time the blow was even heavier. Franz, who could speak 8 foreign languages, looked at her with a joking look that made her feel ashamed. Jenny thought about theology again, and this time she would definitely be able to scare this kid around. Then Jenny saw Archbishop Prussia of Vienna sitting in a chair through the crack of the door, listening attentively to Franz's speech. She immediately gave up her thoughts. How can there be such a difficult little devil? Jenny cursed in her heart, and she remembered Mrs. Sophie's evaluation of Franz as a little monster. Fortunately, Franz's tutor was not wary of Jenny. In fact, Thalia was a fan of Jenny. She admired this perfect lady in her heart and wanted to get closer to her soon. Thalia sold Franz, but Jenny didn't believe it. On the contrary, Jenny felt that this tutor was suspicious. How could a woman want to go to college and become an official? It was simply ridiculous. Thalia even provided her with some new underwear in order to get closer to Jenny. Jenny's first impression of this new type of underwear was that it was very resistant because it could not perfectly reflect the charm of women. But she didn't refuse because she knew that this kind of personal behavior could easily deepen the relationship between the two. Miss Jenny, your figure is so charming. If I were a man, I would definitely fall in love with you. Miss Thalia, you are not bad. You are much bigger than expected. Franz had to pretend not to hear the frolicking in the next room, but his handwriting was crooked. After Jenny tried it once, she couldn't live without this new type of underwear. After all, comfort is more important than anything else. Point later, Jenny learned from Talia that the design of this new underwear was actually the idea of Franz. Ever since, Jenny added a perverted label to Franz's head. Point thank you to book friend. 202103011064960093000 for your monthly ticket and all readers for your support. Point please vote and comment. Chapter 106 The Queen of Darkness. Vienna. Point after the emperor's decree was promulgated, ministers quickly added the prohibition of drugs to the Austrian imperial code. Point because of the hell-drawing incident, drug prohibition has become the consensus of the entire upper-class society. Prince Metternich and Count Korolaf will never provide protection to drug traffickers. They hope to use this to unite the upper class in Vienna. Point with the endorsement of the emperor and the imperial code, the anti-drug campaigners were fearless. Coupled with the appeal of the Habsburg family and the church among the people, a vigorous anti-drug operation began. Point the ban comes after a month of high-profile publicity by the government and churches, but even so, there are still people who continue to sell and manufacture drugs with a sense of luck. Point but this time, what they received was not the earnest persuasion, but the shackles and chains of the military police. Point opium and liquor dens were uprooted one by one, and opium and liquor dealers had to pay huge fines or be thrown into hard labor in the mines. Austria's railway construction urgently needs a large amount of pig iron, and an important reason for Austria's low pig iron production is that no one wants to go to the mines. Therefore, it is too wasteful to execute someone if caught. The Austrian Empire was on the rise and needed labor everywhere. Point in this era, compared with going to the mines to dig coal, it seems so relaxing and comfortable to go to the river to clean up the mud, or to drive iron piles with a sledgehammer in the wind and sun. Point if dozens or hundreds of people die while building a railway or clearing a river channel, it is considered a major accident. However, in a mine, supervisors are not used to it if dozens of people don't die in any given month. Point in this era, no more than 10% of people will be alive after working in the mines for 3 consecutive years. The proposal of sending drug dealers to the mines was widely recognized by the upper class. After all, it seemed more humane. Point it's just a pain for those drug dealers. Some people just think they have found a way to make a fool of themselves, while others want to become a big drug lord like the Sassoon family. Point it's just that before these people's drug lord dreams came true, they were first arrested by the gendarmerie and then sent to the mines to serve their sentences under the judgment of the temporary court. Point in fact, the success of Vienna's anti-drug operations was naturally inseparable from the broad support of all classes. However, objectively speaking, at this time, Vienna's drug traffickers had not yet formed a large scale and had not yet formed a complex network of interests. The royal family and the church had a huge influence on ordinary people. In addition, the opium wine business also affected some businesses of local merchants in Vienna, among which the winners were the most affected. Point naturally, businessmen would not miss this good opportunity to squeeze out their opponents. So the drug dealers in Vienna died unjustly. Point when Solomon Rothschild saw that the opium and wine business was in decline, he cut off from the drug dealers. After all, the cost of selling opium is very low. During this period, he not only recovered the cost of investment, but also made a small profit. Point as for those drug dealers and opium and wine lovers, what does he have to do with it? It's just that Solomon Rothschild's operation greatly offended the gang forces in Vienna. Point there was even a drug gang called the Sweet Wine Gang that offered a reward of 20,000 florins for the assassination of Solomon Rothschild. However, the leader of the Sweet Wine Gang was offered a reward by Solomon the next day and died on the street on the 3rd day. Looking at it this way, some people say that the Rothschild family is the largest gang in Europe, and this statement is not groundless. Franz really couldn't stand the fact that Solomon was still causing so many ups and downs during the lockdown. Point Franz had thought about attacking Solomon's Vienna business alliance before, but Thalia was not good at this kind of thing. She couldn't handle those big businessmen. Franz was not Zhu Jiang, so it was impossible to solve the problem by letters alone. Everything. Point. But now Franz has a helper by his side, and this Jenny is a veteran in social circles. Vienna. Franz study. Point Thalia confessed to her crime and was very proud of it. Did you tell them all? Franz asked. Yes, she is your attendant, and I'm also her subordinate. Thalia answered. How did she react? Franz asked. She said I was so funny. Thalia rolled her eyes. Franz let out a sigh of relief, but fortunately the other party didn't believe him. How? Could you tell me all my details? What will happen if she finds out? Are you going to complain to your mother? Thalia looked nonchalant. Can if Mrs. Sophie thinks that these things may be detrimental to you, the unlucky person must be the person who tells this secret. I really don't understand. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid that your mother won't love you? The person least likely to harm you in this palace is Mrs. Sophie. I always have a feeling that you don't think Mrs. Sophie is your mother. Is it because you didn't raise you personally? Thalia was lying on Franz's desk, fiddling with the globe on the desk boredly. Franz had to admit that the guy in front of him was right. Franz should pay attention to people like Queen Anna and Karl von Slut. They are the only ones who don't want Franz to ascend the throne. Most people in this country don't care whether Franz is a born saint or a monster. However, after Mrs. Sophie gave birth to 3 sons, Queen Anna must have been desperate. Even if Franz could not inherit the throne, it would not be her turn to interfere in Austria's political affairs. One of the purposes of the Regency Council left by Francis II was to prevent Queen Anna from getting involved in politics. Madame Sophie was actually with Franz, but Franz didn't know Jana's identity yet, so he simply stopped pretending and asked Madame Sophie directly. After all, after Jenny entered the palace, she was trained by Madame Sophie for 3 months before reporting to Franz. Madame Sophie should know everything. Lady Sophie's bedroom. Count Zassel is talking to Mrs. Sophie about the future of the Bavarian gang. They have just taken over the territory of the sweet wine gang, but these people cannot live by collecting protection fees. They must go to work, otherwise these Bavarian immigrants will have no value at all. The Bavarian Gang, originally a mutual aid organization for Bavarians, soon saw its potential, and as a former member of the Bavarian royal family and now the Archduchess of Austria, she quickly took control of the organization. The Bavarians are of course willing to have a big man support them, not to mention that this big man is from Bavaria like them. Initially, Mrs. Sophie planned to use this organization as a black glove to collect some intelligence and do things that she would not be able to do in person. However, as Austria joined the German customs union and a large number of Bavarians came to work and live in Vienna, the number of people in this organization also grew exponentially. The Bavaria gang has become the largest gang in Vienna. As the saying goes, there are all kinds of birds in the forest. The Bavaria gang has also changed from the original mutual aid organization to the current semi-military organization. The amount of expenses has been beyond the reach of Mrs. Sophie. Gangs in this era just like to grab territory and collect protection fees. Just now, the Bavaria gang annexed the leaderless sweet wine gang. Mrs. Sophie felt that if she didn't do something, she would soon become the queen of the underworld in Vienna. Chapter 107 Bavarian Mutual Aid Association. Schönbrunn Palace. Madame Sophie's Palace. 7,000 people. How come there are so many? Mrs. Sophie looked very surprised. You must know that, although the number of people in Vienna at this time was much larger than that at the same time in history, there were only less than 500,000. London, the largest city in this era, had a population of 2 million, followed by Paris with 800,000, and Vienna with 500,000. Berlin at this time had only 300,000 people. A gang of 7,000 people was really an exaggeration. In order to ensure the loyalty of those people, you asked the whole family to join. Now it's better. This group of people is like mice moving endlessly. They have called all the relatives from Bavaria, plus the gang members who defected to us. It's difficult even if you don't think too much. Zassel smiled and handed a document to Madame Sophie. Madame Sophie looked at it twice and became even more worried. Why did you lose so much? I clearly told you to restrain yourself, Mom. Do you plan to be the boss? Franz, why are you here? Franz's appearance startled Mrs. Sophie, and the maid on the side could only look at Mrs. Sophie with a very embarrassed look and said something. I'm sorry, Archduke Franz didn't let me inform you. Mother, I have something to tell you, Mrs. Sophie said as she glanced around the room. Everyone, please go out. I have something to say to Archduke Franz. The maids in the room immediately bowed and left. Count Zassel stood at the door and looked at Mrs. Sophie. Mrs. Sophie waved her hand, and Count Zasel exited the door, and closed the door before Franz could speak. Mrs. Sophie picked up Franz, and put him on her lap as if showing off, and then handed him 2 documents. My little monster, please help me think about how to deal with this matter first. Franz looked at the data on the 2 documents, and combined it with the information he got from Thalia. He knew why Mrs. Sophie was worried. Mother, your Bavarian gang should have been called the Bavarians Mutual Aid Committee. Mrs. Sophie thought about it, and it seemed that it was called this name, but at that time it was a macro organization with only a few dozen people. Her wish at that time was to expand the organization to 200 people. Times have changed, and the current scale has far exceeded the limits of her control point. Seeing that Mrs. Sophie did not speak, Franz continued, what you should be providing is a platform, not keeping them together like pets. Although Franz's words were unpleasant, Mrs. Sophie's current state was like a little girl raising a hamster for the first time. Facing so many baby hamsters that she couldn't raise, but was reluctant to throw them away. Franz, what do you mean by platform? That is, you should build an intermediary platform to allow information, resources, personnel, etc. to flow freely and be combined reasonably, instead of over-interfering like you do. In order to maintain this organization and this platform, you can consider charging them membership fees. Franz said. Mrs. Sophie was not an idiot. She knew what to do as soon as Franz said it, but with a woman's intuition, she knew that there was something in Franz's words. Franz, what you want to say can be said now. Mom, what's going on with Miss Jenny? I think she's weird. What is her identity? Your attendant. You weren't staring at people at the ball. I just fulfilled a small dream for you. Mrs. Sophie teased with a smile. Mother, I want to know who she is. Franz said seriously. Mrs. Sophie put away her smile and stood up, walked to a cabinet, pulled out a stack of documents, and threw them to Franz. It contains her height, weight, body measurements, life history and everything you want to know. Franz just glanced at it twice before putting down the document in his hand. Mother, why did you bring such a dangerous person in? Franz, don't worry, that is in the past, and now she works for our family. But what if she betrays you? It's okay, you still have 2 younger brothers. Aren't you always looking for help? I think Miss Thalia can help you, and by the way, she can also help me monitor you. I'm wrong. She is helping me to watch you, and don't do stupid things. Why don't you tell me why you are hoarding so much food and involving the entire royal family? Madame Sophie asked the biggest question in her mind. Mother, it is impossible to have a good harvest of food every year. There is a saying that things will turn to the extreme. A long-term good harvest makes people forget the pain of hunger, but God will not forget the suffering that mankind deserves. Faced with a devout believer like Mrs. Sophie, Franz could only bring out God. He could not tell Mrs. Sophie that he was actually a time traveler. He knew that there would be a great famine in Central and Eastern Europe before 1840, but because he could not remember it's the Qing dynasty, so I have to prepare in advance. Well, Franz, I hope God bless you to be right, otherwise the entire Habsburg family will be bankrupted by you. Mrs. Sophie said, it's not like we haven't been bankrupt before. It has always been a fine tradition of our family to not pay back money we owe. You have to stick to it, and you are the only one who will go bankrupt, because you have mortgaged all your properties. I didn't, and neither did Archduke Carol. Franz found it very interesting, but Mrs. Sophie didn't like it very much, so she simply grabbed Franz's face. That won't work. You have to find a way out. Love, mother, you hurt me. This world has been peaceful for too long. Everyone is ready to make a move. Sooner or later, these grains will come in handy. Especially the Mexicans. They have the largest silver mine in the world, but their agriculture cannot support themselves. The only 2 options before them are to spend money to buy food, or continue to fight the civil war. Far East, Kabul. King Dust of Afghanistan was receiving the British envoy. At this time, Afghanistan had just lost the important southern town of Peshawar to the Sikh state. One of the Indian princes. The British were the biggest enemies of the Sikhs in India. At this time, the British had controlled most of India, and even the Sikh Empire had to bow to the British. The British hope to join forces with Dust to fight against Russia, because Russia's power in Central Asia has approached Afghanistan, and the British are very wary of anything that may threaten British India. But Dust hoped to get the British to support him in retaking Peshawar, but the British refused on the pretext that they were not ready to fight the Sikhs. Later, the Russian envoy also came to Kabul. In order to bring the two countries closer, the Russian envoy expressed support for Dust to regain Peshawar. In fact, the three parties all wanted to be a free hand, but this time the verbal promise of a free hand was exaggerated by some people, saying that Russia was preparing to attack India through Afghanistan. At this time, the British governor of India could not sit still and immediately wrote to the country, requesting that troops be sent to occupy Kabul before Russia. As a result, Britain suffered the most tragic defeat after the Napoleonic Wars. Chapter 108 Sleeping Butler, Schönbrunn Palace, Franz's study. Franz had just returned to his study and placed Jana's files in a secret compartment. Suddenly, Franz felt Thalia lying on her stomach. Thalia, what are you going to do? Franz, I want to ask you something. Franz glanced at it. The room was cleaned spotlessly, and she still smelled of the perfume given to her by the old emperor. Yes, it is normal for men in this era to spray perfume. For many nobles, they may not take a bath, but they must spray perfume. Franz was not honored to be a member of the aromatherapy party, because he enjoyed the refreshing pleasure after bathing more than covering up the odor of sweat with fragrance. So he donated all the perfumes he received to Thalia. But usually Thalia uses scents like lavender, but this time it's cologne, so Franz can tell the difference so quickly. Is the bedkeeper still responsible for warming your bed? Franz nodded, knowing that Thalia must have some bad intentions. Well, look at it. How is your iron bed warm? How about not as good as what? Why don't you let her help me warm the bed? Thalia said excitedly. There's something wrong with you. What's wrong? I'm afraid of the cold, Thalia argued. Then, you still wear so little. Franz pointed at Thalia's collarbone. It's all exposed. Thalia struggled to pull up her clothes. What did we talk about? It's a bed warmer, right? Of course. But I want to tell you, in fact, the bed butler is not what you think. Franz said. It's just that after Thalia listened to the first half of the sentence, she ran out, maybe intending to open a bottle of champagne to celebrate. In fact, it is usually not women's turn to hold the positions of secretary, and financial steward. Women usually can only serve as bedroom maids, and the key to the master's bedroom is hung around their necks, symbolizing the master's trust in them and their own status. If you think about it, you will know that the bedkeepers in history could not all sleep in the same bed as the owner. In fact, their duty was just to make the bed. Then put something like a small heater under the quilt to keep the bed warm, so that the owner can spend every cold night comfortably. Hotel Hof, Prince Schwarzenberg Estate. An unusual dance is being held here. The host of the dance was a beautiful lady, and the table was filled with all kinds of food and wine, but everyone who attended the dance seemed worried. Caught between the Rothschilds and this mysterious woman, they don't know what to do. This woman did not explain her identity, but judging from the fact that she was favored by Count Korolov and Prince Metternich at the same time, and could even become the maid of Archduke Franz Joseph, she was by no means simple, and even had maybe it was the nail that the royal family released into the business world of the Austrian Empire. The hesitation of these people in front of him had long been expected by Franz, so what he asked Jenny to do was to establish a new business organization, the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry. This way they didn't have to worry about offending either Solomon or the royal family. There's no harm in joining one more organization. You don't have to pay membership fees like the Vienna Business League, and you can even sell a Jenny a favor. But what those businessmen didn't know was that their behavior was a naked betrayal in the eyes of Solomon Rothschild. Of course, how can His Majesty the King accept the betrayal of his ministers? When Solomon looked at the list, his hands were shaking with anger and he couldn't help but curse. The second minister is a traitor. However, Solomon was a little confused. This woman, a Jenny, should be a member of the Polish Restoration Army. Before He thought that Prince Metternich and Count Korolov were just looking for excitement on a whim, but now it seems that all this seems to be a conspiracy against him, Solomon Rothschild. Point. And who is the mastermind behind this? Is it Madame Sophie? Is it the legendary Archduke Franz Karol, who was much as wise as he was foolish? Or another Archduke Karol? Suddenly, for a moment, Solomon Rothschild felt that the whole of Austria seemed to be targeting him. Point. Just like the opium business before, doctors clearly said it was a medicine, and patients said it was good after using it. How could it become a blasphemy against God? In the words of the church, the civil code of the Austrian Empire now stipulates that opium can only be used for therapeutic purposes and cannot be used for commercial purposes. No merchant is allowed to add opium to food and drinks. Solomon decided to let those capricious villains know the consequences of betrayal. Point. Solomon's attack was effective, but he soon found that the members of the Vienna Business League were getting fewer and fewer, while the members of the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry were increasing. Point. Even those members who did not join the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry no longer looked at Solomon with the same respect as in the past, but were full of fear and resentment. Point. Jenny has no problem with her negotiation skills, and has her own network. After she became Franz's attendant, the number of people pursuing her not only did not decrease, but more and more people pursued her. Some even hoped to get through Jenny. Take Franz's line. Point. Jenny is able to navigate this complex network of relationships with ease, but she is not a business genius, and cannot handle those complex business relationships, let alone seize so-called business opportunities. So Franz asked her to find an assistant, Lucien Sinner, a former rival of the Rothschild family and a descendant of the Sinner family. Point. Lucien Sinner was a small civil servant during the day and a scribe at night. He was over 40 but unmarried. All the money he saved was used to repay the debts owed by his ancestors. Although it was a drop in the bucket, Franz felt that this person could be used, and at least his character was passable. Point. And there was already a printing press in this era, but manuscripts were more expensive than printed copies, because manuscripts have always been sought after by nobles, because they can highlight their status. The price of manuscripts has always remained high. Point. In fact, in addition to Lucien Sinner, there is also Captain Perish in the Royal Guard, and his family is also the mortal enemy of the Rothschild family. Point. It's just that this Captain Perish really has no talent. He is better at duels than business intrigues and mutual calculations. Captain Perish was a tough man who had already won 15 duels, but there was no doubt that Solomon Rothschild would not duel with him. Point. Vienna, Royal Garden. Point. Captain Perish raised his hands. Although the result was a double kill, his opponent was just a 7-year-old kid participating in practice for the first time. Point. You must know that Captain Perish has been studying the technology of the swift sword for more than 20 years. He has killed 14 people with the swift sword. He has never felt pressure. But facing Franz, he had to fight with all his strength. Archduke Franz, you are really a genius, but your approach is very bad. Double killing is not a commendable approach. You killed me, but I also killed you. So for people like you, it's said that the gain outweighs the loss. Captain Perish, if I compete with you normally, is it possible to win? Franz asked. Perish felt that Franz was right, but Franz's thoughts were very dangerous, and he didn't know what to say, so he could only scratch his head anxiously. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 109, Allah's Ambition. Egypt, Alexandria. Point. After that fiasco, Muhammad Ali, the Egyptian Pasha, the conqueror of Sudan, learned from the painful experience and decided to reform the navy. On the one hand, he purchased advanced warships from France, and on the other hand, he purchased advanced technology to train workers to build warships by himself. The Egyptian Navy now has 1 second-level battleship, 15 third-level battleships, and hundreds of light gunboats of various types. Ali Pasha admired his fleet, but his trump card was still hidden in the dock. Point. In the dock, 9 huge first-level battleships are being built. In addition to 10 already built third-level battleships. With these warships, Egypt would become the second largest naval power in the world, but Ali Pasha's ambitions went far beyond that point. Just a month before, Ali Pasha's envoys had arrived in St. Petersburg. Ali Pasha's envoy handed over Egypt's credentials. After reading it saw Nicholas I sneered and threw the credentials to the ground. That Egyptian, what's your name? Anyone who is familiar with Sydney Gulai knows that this is a time when the Tsar wants to kill someone. In the letter of credence submitted to Russia, Ali Pasha stated that he was willing to use the Tigris River as the boundary, divide the river and rule with the Tsar, and share the heritage of the Ottoman Empire. Egypt was willing to ally with Russia to fight against Britain. Egypt would give up the territory of the Eastern Roman Empire and was willing to surrender to the Tsar and pay tribute every year. This is the most ridiculous joke Nicholas I has ever heard. Why does Egypt want to divide the Ottoman Empire with Russia? With their sense of humor, at this time, the messenger replied, Egyptians have no names. Egyptians are all servants of Ali. You can call me Abdul. But I want to remind you that you just dropped our country's credentials on the ground. I can pick it up for you. The messenger answered in a neither humble nor condescending manner, which surprised Nicholas I. He was a very murderous person. Even those Cossack leaders who would kill their whole families at every turn would have their legs tremble unconsciously when they saw Nicholas I. Nicholas I did not answer, but looked at Abdullah coldly. In fact, Abdullah was already sweating profusely, but his family was in the hands of Ali Pasha, and he could only succeed but not fail. Dear Your Majesty the Tsar, why don't you first take a look at the gift Ali Pasha has prepared for you? Nicholas I still sat silently on the throne, his left hand clenched into a fist and supporting his chin, like a lion waiting for prey. Boxes of gold and silver jewelry passed in front of Nicholas I's eyes, and his expression did not change at all. Until a group of trembling people crawled in front of Nicholas I, and he suddenly stood up with anger in his eyes. Nicholas I had a very majestic figure. He was 205 centimeters tall and had been exercising for many years. When he stood up, he felt so oppressive that the Egyptian envoy couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. He knew why Nicholas I was angry. The Russian Tsar had always regarded himself as the savior of the Orthodox Church, and according to the Orthodox tradition, he had the obligation to save all Orthodox believers. Even in the darkest moments of Eastern Europe, when the Tatars, Crimeans, and Ottomans were rampant, the Tsar would spend money from his own treasury every year to redeem people from the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. Now Nicholas I saw a group of Russian slaves appearing in his palace. He could not accept it emotionally or morally. However, this was Abdul's gift. He knew that Ali Pasha's gold and silver could not impress the Tsar at all. Only these Russian slaves could arouse the Tsar's anger and choose to reach a secret agreement with Egypt. Your Majesty the Tsar, I bought them in the slave market of the Ottoman Empire. I now return your subjects to you. I hope you. Before Abdul had finished speaking, the Tsar grabbed him by the neck and lifted him up. In the hands of Nicholas I, who is 2.05 meters tall, Abdullah, who is 1.55 meters tall, is like a child. Tell Muhammad Ali that I accept his gift, but if one day I find a Russian slave on Egyptian soil, I guarantee that my troops will crush Cairo. No chickens or dogs will be spared. Abdul was thrown out like trash by Nicholas I, and he turned to the Russians and said, "Get up, you are free." The slaves looked at each other and stood up carefully. In fact, they had lived in the Ottoman Empire for several generations. Apart from their appearance, they could not even understand Russian, and they were unlikely to have met the Tsar. They only know that they were bought by an Egyptian master, and now they have been sold to a more powerful master. The strange thing is that this master looks very similar to them, but it is a bit scary. Nicholas I did not pay attention to the strange behavior of these slaves, and just waved his hand and asked his crony, Grand Duke Liu, to take them away. In fact, Nicholas I didn't care about any secret agreements. Russia had torn up a mountain of secret agreements, and this one was not missing. It is better to accept the gift first and see what the Egyptians are going to do. If the Egyptians can severely damage the British fleet, it will be great for Russia. As for what if the Egyptians lose? Then just pretend that nothing happened and accept the gift anyway. Ali Pasha was overjoyed that Nicholas I could agree to a secret agreement with Egypt, because just now the Fier's government had assured Ali that if a war broke out between Britain and Egypt, France could intervene when necessary. But Ali's Egyptian government must ensure French interests in Egypt, and Ali Pasha knew what Fier's wanted. Now Egypt has become the second largest cotton exporter after the United States, and France has also become the world's second largest cotton importer. France's textile industry cannot do without Egypt for a day. When Egypt was invaded by France, Napoleon's power was still fresh in his memory. But Ali Pasha did not expect the French to send troops directly, but he thought that, as long as the French saw the opportunity to defeat the British, the French would not let this opportunity go. Speaking of Napoleon, Ali Pasha always believed that Egypt was the cemetery of powerful empires. The Roman Empire lost to Cleopatra, the Mongol Empire lost to the Mamluks, Napoleon lost to the rebels, and he, Muhammad Ali, wanted here, end the overlord of the world's oceans, Britain, and create his own legend. Ali Pasha, looking at the giant ship being built in the dock, suddenly felt a surge of pride in his chest. Because no one knew the existence of these warships, he could use this information gap to defeat the arrogant British. Because the British did not know the existence of these warships, it was impossible to send all the main forces to the battlefield at once. If the last experience is followed, the British will only send 2 to 3 first-level battleships to sit in, supplemented by some third-level battleships, to act as escorts. Then what the Egyptian Navy has to do is to annihilate them all. If possible, it is best to make the British surrender, so that the Egyptian Navy will be even stronger. After the British suffered a disastrous defeat, they would inevitably get angry and come for revenge. As long as they were not stupid, they would definitely ask the Ottomans for help. Then Ali's real trump card would come into play, because the British would not have expected it anyway. The fleet had long been bought by Ali. The self-righteous British had no choice but to surrender when they were attacked from 2 sides. If the British Navy is eliminated, the Egyptian Navy can dominate the ocean. At that time, it will be able to annex the legacy of the Ottoman Empire and draw the Tigris River as the boundary with Russia. In another 10 years, he would be able to build a 1 million-strong army, march north to defeat Russia, and dominate Europe, Asia, and Africa. There are 2 opinions about the height of Nicholas I. One is 1.9 meters, the other is 2.05 meters. The previous book was written as 1.9 meters, so this time it is written as 2.05 meters, so more oppressive. Chapter 110 The Return of the God of War. Defeated the British at sea, defeated the Russians on land, invaded the Balkans, defeated Austria, captured Italy, used France to destroy the British, and from then on the Arabs had no rivals in the world. Defeat the British at sea and the Russians on land. Anyway, France did not dare to think about such a thing for the time being. Even if things could develop in the direction Ali Pasha expected, a naval battle would not only be a competition in the number of warships. The British have been able to dominate the oceans for hundreds of years, which is definitely not what the Egyptian Navy can catch up with in just 10 years. Franz was thinking about whether there was any way to solve this crisis without losing any blood. After all, war is not a good thing for Austria. The price of cotton in the world has been falling in recent years, which makes many people optimistic about the prospects of the textile industry. With continuous investment, the textile industry is blooming everywhere, and even Mrs. Sophie is involved. However, this good boom will not last forever. Due to the impact of the economic crisis in 1837, a large number of American cotton farmers went bankrupt. Coupled with the increase in market demand, the price of cotton will explode. Affected by the German customs union, Austria has unconsciously joined the Red Sea battlefield in the textile industry. If it relies too much on American cotton, it will have to incorporate its economic security into the Anglo-American system and withstand the impact of Anglo-American economic fluctuations. In fact, even the British know that Americans are unreliable. They have long started growing cotton in India, but the scale and quality are much worse. At this time, the cotton produced in India was not even considered a second-class product in the United States, and the inferior cotton fabrics processed had almost no market and could only be sold to the colonies. But Egyptian cotton is different. The quality of long staple cotton here is the best in the world, and it is also strongly supported by local rulers at this time. The rise of the French textile industry was inseparable from the introduction of large quantities of Egyptian cotton. Not only France, but also small states in Italy are very fond of Egyptian cotton. Austria is also willing to get involved. Of course, the British have also discovered this treasure land. In order to ensure Britain's interests in the Near East, Egypt is an indispensable part of its territory. Precisely because the Turkey-Egypt war is inevitable, even if Egypt and the Ottoman Empire do not want to fight, the British will let them fight. Is the name of the world's #1 shit stirrer just an unfounded reputation? All Austria can do is try to protect its own interests, strive for more benefits as much as possible, and avoid its own losses, such as its international status historically. Britain took the opportunity of the Turkish-Egyptian war to throw Metternich and his system into the trash can. During this crisis, all his proposals and negotiations were treated as toilets by Palmerston. The paper is trampled. It will point the Turkish-Egyptian war actually became a chessboard on which Britain, France, and Russia competed, while Austria only acted as a spectator and a chess piece for people to play with. When France was dissatisfied with the London Agreement, it threatened to conquer Vienna first. When Palmerston discussed the Near East issue, he often skipped Austria. Although Prussia's experience was similar to Austria's, Prussia at least did not need to send troops. There is no need to consider the Near East. Franz once imagined using diplomatic means to resolve the Turkish-Egyptian war, but at this time all countries had clear positions on the Near East issue and each had their own opinions, unless France planned to change history. However, the cost of changing history was too high, and Austria itself, due to its location, it cannot easily fall to either side, otherwise it will have to withstand the concentrated fire attack from the other side. At the crossroads of Europe, with an undefendable border, and the ocean to the south, Austria can suffer all-round attacks from all directions. Then the problem comes back. Austria must be strong enough in this crisis to solve its own face crisis. Franz was thinking about whether he should train a Marine Corps. After all, Austria was much more confident in land warfare than in naval warfare. But where to choose a strong army is another problem. Franz did have an army in Salzburg, but those people were all cavalry. Their combat effectiveness was not to mention, and their loyalty was guaranteed, but they were really overqualified. Although the cavalry of this era is no longer the protagonist on the battlefield, it still plays an irreplaceable role in reconnaissance, harassment and killing. Usually those responsible for flanking raids are not elite cavalry, because flanking raids do not require cavalry to kill infantry, as long as they can disrupt the enemy's formation. So flanking cavalry often never return. Of course, if one side is penetrated by flanking cavalry, the battle is over. Vienna, Royal Garden. France, Thalia, and Ajani were staring at Archduke Friedrich. Friedrich had just completed the escort mission, but he didn't look like the god of war had returned at all. Instead, he looked like a hungry ghost who hadn't eaten in several lifetimes. Soon Friedrich swept away his food in front of Franz. Franz pushed his food forward, and Friedrich was not polite, and started eating immediately. Ajani quickly asked people to prepare more food. In fact, it is not difficult to get some food in the palace. The key is that carrying it from the kitchen to the royal garden is a technical job. As for the dining car, according to regulations, it cannot be pushed into the royal garden. While eating, Friedrich cried, "Franz, you are such a good man." Before the waiter came forward to wipe Friedrich's mouth, he took a napkin and wiped it on his face. "It's so bitter. I finally understand why no one becomes a navy anymore." Franz looked at Friedrich. His skin was indeed tanned, and he had lost a lot of weight. It seemed that life at sea was very hard. Franz knew that sailors during this period were very miserable, but he did not believe that the royal prince, captain, and formation commander would also be very miserable, even if he was beaten to death. Friedrich said, while chewing on a pork chop, "Franz, you don't know that I have prepared a total of 80,000 florins for this voyage, and I asked the shipwrights to check it inside and out so many times, but they couldn't find even a stain on the deck. However, in fact, before going to sea, as Friedrich said, they prepared a large amount of bread, salted fish, salted meat, various plants, vegetables, and even live chickens, live ducks, pigs, cows, sheep, etc. To pass the time, he also brought a band and several painters. Since naval regulations prohibit bringing women on board, he would otherwise plan to bring a few ballerinas and the like, to hold a dance occasionally. After a few days at sea, Friedrich felt bored, so he went out to inspect the warships. He found that the sailors on the ship were all listless. After asking several people, he could not find out the reason. So, he planned to observe the public sentiment, and went to the sailors' residence. During this period, several naval officers tried to stop Friedrich. However, this aroused Friedrich's curiosity even more. After all, he was only 16 years old. Chapter 111 Friedrich and Life of Fantasy. As soon as the cabin door was opened, the smell of pickled pig's feet hit the nostrils. Coupled with the strange and disgusting smell, a musician who was close to Friedrich fainted on the spot. However, Friedrich did not shrink back. He held his chest up and raised his head, facing the stench, and walked in. However, as soon as he entered the door, his feet slipped, and he took a closer look. It turned out to be a pool of unknown vomit. Due to the stuffy heat and humidity in the cabin, the beach vomit was still dripping down. Friedrich personally picked up the mop nearby and cleaned up the vomit. This was of course done for the officers to see. The officers also understood and immediately took water and cleaning tools to prepare for a good cleaning of the cabin. The sailors slept in hammocks. The hammocks were densely packed like spider webs. When the sailors heard the officer coming, they immediately got out of the hammocks. Many of them had no clothes on and could only temporarily use food bowls and other things to cover themselves. Almost everyone smelled bad, and one of the sailors reported that he couldn't hold it in anymore and wanted to take advantage of it. Friedrich naturally had no reason to refuse, but when he saw the sailor actually ran towards the bow of the ship. He asked very puzzledly, how does he get to the bow of the ship? Isn't the toilet at the stern of the ship? In fact, Friedrich had a special toilet and a special toilet. At this time, an officer reminded, the soldiers' toilets are at the bow of the ship, and the officers' toilets are at the stern. Friedrich thought that it was too unsanitary to defecate in the bow of the ship, and he felt that he had to check it out. In fact, the soldiers' toilets have always been at the bow of the ship, because this is the easiest place to clean on the entire ship. After all, there are waves on the sea. It comes with a flushing function, and you don't have to press the button. It's just a specific flushing function. Time depends on the mood of nature. There are also battleships of this era, called sailing battleships. As the name suggests, they rely on the wind, so although they are at the bow, they are in the leeward, so that the strange smell will not be blown back to the faces of the crew. This was the first time Friedrich knew that the platform under the bow of the ship was used for this purpose. After seeing the living conditions of the crew, Friedrich made a bold decision to follow the example of his father and eldest brother. Friedrich's father, Archduke Karl, was the commander-in-chief of the Austrian Empire and the first man to end Napoleon's undefeated myth. Friedrich's eldest brother, Archduke Albrecht, was a hero in the two Italian wars in history and the last famous general of the Austrian Empire. He was now hailed as the future of the Austrian Imperial Army. They all ate and lived with the soldiers, because Archduke Karl once said that to understand the combat effectiveness of the soldiers, you only need to eat their food, wear their clothes, and live in their rooms. So Friedrich hung a hammock on the deck to experience the feeling of the crew. Although he was burned by the sun, he was determined not to rest in the cabin because it was too smelly. However, the wind and waves soon taught him a lesson. In the past, the Austrian Navy's range of operations was only in the Adriatic Gulf. Although there were wind and waves, compared with the wind and waves in the Atlantic, it was just playing house. A big wave would almost cover the entire area. Friedrich flew out of the boat. It was sunny just a moment ago, but it would rain heavily in the blink of an eye. What really made him despair was the food. The crew could not cook a small stove. They ate some moldy bread, stinky beef, and sour cheese that was stuck together with something unknown. The most terrifying thing was the oatmeal that remained unchanged every day. In the eyes of the nobles, oats were actually horse feed. The ship's doctor had to often ask Archduke Friedrich to check up on him in order to bring him some real food. By the end, Friedrich had become accustomed to the occasional discovery of rat droppings in oatmeal and half-cut maggots in moldy bread. Of course, if you think that's all, you'd be totally wrong. The water on the ship was even more terrifying. The water Friedrich drank before was distilled, filtered, and precipitated using a special device. After that, sugar, lemon and a little tea were added, and it was usually used to make tea or brew coffee. The crew's drinking water is usually stored in large wooden barrels, and bacteria will inevitably enter every time it is taken. The water usually becomes smelly within 15 to 20 days. At this time, the crew often considers using beer instead of drinking water. After the beer was gone, the rum that the sailors carried with them came on stage. This thing is an artifact that can cure scurvy, but it also has a special task at this time, which is to purify water. After all, after the water in those wooden barrels had been left for a month, it was filled with various microorganisms, and the entire barrel might even be covered with green mosses for the water quality inside. Take a look at a fish tank that hasn't had its water changed for a month. That kind of flavorful, sticky, and creamy texture is not something that most people can tolerate. Adding some rum can kill bacteria, mask the smell, and prevent scurvy. It's perfect. This is why sailors in this era always look dizzy, and almost none of them are not drunkards. A classic image of a sailor at this time is that he is tall, moves slowly, and always looks very melancholy. He wears a blue-collar white shirt, a greasy and dirty scarf tied around his neck, his hands are rough, his face is scarred, and he drank a bottle of rum in one gulp, not caring that the liquid flowed down his beard. The most unfortunate thing for Friedrich was that one time he was going to the toilet on the bow of the ship, and a wave happened to hit him, throwing the unlucky child into the embrace of the sea. When the crew saw Archduke Friedrich falling into the water, they threw out ropes to rescue him, but Archduke Friedrich refused to grab the rope. So a large group of officers jumped into the sea to save the unfortunate Grand Duke, only to find that the Grand Duke's trousers had been washed away by the sea water. For the Grand Duke's face, they had to claim that the Grand Duke was just swimming, and then found a flag to cover the Grand Duke's trousers. The lower body was wrapped up before returning to the boat. Of course, Friedrich would not say all these words to Franz face to face. After all, failure was also their point in front of women. Men cannot lose face, even if they lose anything. This is a matter of principle. Vienna, Royal Garden. Franz observed 3 seconds of silence for Friedrich's misfortune. Now, do you understand the importance of steam battleships? If you use a steam battleship this time, the voyage will be much shorter, and you won't have to endure so much hardship. By the way, those soldiers now regard you as one of your own, Franz asked, only to hear Friedrich cry again with a wow. They said I was a fool. Jenny unfolded the fan in her hand and blocked her smiling face to prevent her from hurting Archduke Friedrich's self-esteem. Thalia also imitated Ajani's appearance, but her movements were not very graceful. At this time, Friedrich also saw Ajani, and he only had one thought in his mind. Mrs. Sophie was so kind to Franz, because a certain book friend always chatted with me privately and asked me to write a tasteful article. So I wrote a tasteful chapter. Chapter 112 Marine Corps. Vienna, Royal Garden. Franz noticed that Friedrich's eyes glanced at Ajani from time to time, and Franz looked back at Ajani helplessly. Ajani understood what Franz meant, and could also see Friedrich's thoughts. She put away her fan, lifted up her skirt, and saluted Archduke Friedrich gracefully. It is an honor to meet you, your esteemed Archduke Friedrich. I'm Ajani D. Boyce, Chamberlain to Archduke Franz. Ah, there's still female attendants? Is this kind of operation? Friedrich blurted out. In fact, the number of female chamberlains is indeed very small, and even most of Queen Teresa's chamberlains are men. Friedrich disliked his attendants' too verbose words and deeds, so he always kept him at home and almost never let him go out with him. If he had known that he could still operate like this, he would have asked his father to arrange a female equerry for him. At least he would have someone to talk to in the Navy. Friedrich was suddenly shocked by the thoughts that came to his mind. He was obviously not like this, but Franz's tutor and attendant were really. Why is my tutor an old woman? and the attendant is a bald man who smokes a pipe all day long. Friedrich once again lamented the unfairness of fate. Friedrich, I have a suggestion. You should consider forming a Marine Corps. Franz was not prepared to continue the previous topic with Friedrich on this issue. Marine Corps? We have a ready-made army in the Austrian Empire. Wouldn't it be better to just ship it there? And setting up the Marine Corps requires additional funding. Now the Ministry of War has a very tight budget. This is actually related to the operational thinking. The Navy is not necessarily good at land warfare, and the Army is not necessarily good at naval warfare. But once the troops need to carry out amphibious landing operations, this is the biggest weakness. The simplest thing is that you don't know whether these army soldiers will get seasick or whether they can swim and row. Do you expect that when attacking the port dock, the warship can be anchored at the opponent's dock? Do you think the other side's coastal defense guns are just decorations? In fact, the Marine Corps during this period was more appropriately called maritime infantry. Only Britain, France, and the United States have professional marines. Other countries do the same thing as Friedrich said, and simply ship their armies there. But amphibious operations in the future will become increasingly important and cruel. Continuing the practices of hundreds of years ago is tantamount to nothing. If the Navy does not have a direct landing force, it will be easily controlled by others. The mission of the Marine Corps is not only to seize and land on beaches, but also to conduct reconnaissance, clearing obstacles, blasting, infiltration, and assassination. It is unrealistic for the army to perform all these tasks. You think, on a dark night, a group of soldiers quietly rowed the boat a few hundred meters away from the shore, and then a group of landlubbers jumped into the waves, slowly advancing with the waves, under a dark rock lodge in point. A group of enemy patrols happened to pass by. Just when everyone was holding their breath, suddenly there was a sound of wow and the soldier vomited. The mission failed. Therefore, it is still very important to establish a professional Marine Corps. Friedrich was not an idiot. In fact, he was very supportive of the establishment of the Marine Corps. After all, the Marine Corps also belonged to the Navy, which made it easier for him to deploy tactics. It's just that due to funding and face, he never proposed it. This time Franz proposed this idea, and Friedrich was very happy. He felt that he had finally found a like-minded friend. Although Franz's support could not provide actual help, it was enough for him. Franz, what do you think about the Marine Corps? Friedrich asked. I think your Marine Corps should not be limited to maritime infantry. I suggest that you select elite soldiers from the Gauges and train them. These people can be responsible for reconnaissance, destruction, infiltration, landing, and anti-landing missions. Chasseurs? Are you talking about those mountain people? They are not good, let alone whether they can adapt to the sea environment. Those people are very poorly organized and have very strong individual skills. There are often legends about a hunter who can kill the entire enemy's reconnaissance team with just a hunting knife. But if they get together, if there is any disturbance, they can scatter in all directions, often causing the surrounding troops to collapse. Friedrich shook his head wildly, as if he could not trust those soldiers who came from the mountains at all. At this time, the people who were at the bottom of the contempt chain of the entire Austrian Empire were not the Jews, but the Gypsies, Croats, and Tyroleans. Many of the Tyroleans had German ancestry, but because their accents sounded like Swiss, they often not treated as a human being. Franz asked, seeing that Friedrich seemed confident. Do you have anyone in mind? Of course, I think the sailors in Venice are very good. They are either fighting or on the way to fight every day. The most important thing is that they are sailors themselves. They just need to train in land warfare. Italians? Let's forget it. I'm afraid they will surrender as soon as the battle begins. Although Franz knew that this was a stereotype and knew how fierce the sailors in Venice were, he still felt unhappy. No matter what point, Franz felt that the Italians were not suitable for fighting. Although they were good at gang fighting, such as the Mafia, they seemed to lack the courage to see their bayonets red on the battlefield. When it comes to Italy, Franz can only think of spaghetti, macaroni, Milanese heroes, the rapture of Ginglowo, and the beautiful legend of Sicily. In short, it has nothing to do with weapons and war. How could it be? Italians regard honor as more important than life. I suggest you feed them well, before letting them go to the battlefield, otherwise some unexpected situations may occur. In addition, I suggest you recruit some soldiers from other areas. After all, Venice and Lombardy people don't seem to be that loyal. I understand what you are saying, but the poor people in Venice are usually not anti-Austrian, because under Austrian rule, the poor are better off than in the past. The real anti-Austrian people are the rich and the nobles of the Venetian era. They always feel that they have not been affected. Treat them fairly, and hope to expand their influence within the empire. And I heard that your father suggested to the emperor that those traitors who beat the Austrian officers should be severely punished. It was really good. Pay tribute to your father on my behalf. Those self-righteous traitors should have been punished long ago, but both Marshal Radetzky and General Reich were very shy about punishing Italian nobles. I was wrong. I have not been to northern Italy. I just heard some things about this, but I still don't recommend that you only use Venetians as for those traitors who deserve their punishment. How could the royal family allow soldiers loyal to the empire to suffer unjust injustice? In fact, the Austrian Empire's policy of compromise towards the Italian region originated from the period of Franz II. Franz II always felt that he was an Italian and had asked the Austrian Imperial government to treat Italians fairly more than once. After the death of Franz II, the support of the Italian region became the focus of competition between Count Korolov and Prince Metternich, so the entire Austria was repeatedly accommodating to the Italian region. Chapter 113 The Beggar Emperor. In history, there are only two people who were born as beggars and eventually became kings of a country. One is Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming dynasty, and the other is Ali Pasha of Egypt. The new vizier boasted of Ali Pasha's achievements. Abdul was named vizier by Muhammad Ali because of his successful mission to Russia and signing a secret agreement with Tsar Nicholas I. The official position of prime minister in Egyptian history is also called vizier, and Ali Pasha's ambition is already obvious. He wants to be the Sultan of Egypt and establish an Arab empire, not a Turkic bastard. Franz still has some respect for this kind of tycoon who can achieve great dominance with just one bowl at the beginning, but this era does not belong to Egypt. Ali Pasha understood that victory in the naval battle was just his ticket to participate in the partition of the Ottoman Empire. The real decisive battle was still on land. Since the French refused to sell the formula of mercury fulminate to Egypt, the Egyptians could only make flintlock guns naturally. Ali Pasha would not give in. He ordered his craftsmen to develop percussion guns. However, there was no craftsman in Egypt who could make percussion guns. As a last resort, Egyptian officials had to spend 10,000 florins to obtain the formula of mercury fulminate and the design drawings of the percussion gun from Tuscany. The formula for mercury fulminate is actually very simple, but at this time Egyptian chemistry had not yet developed to the level of alchemy in the Middle Ages, so it is not surprising that mercury fulminate could not be made. Of course, Ali's ambition was not just satisfied by building a few guns. He also needed powerful artillery. The Austrian M1832 super artillery, a plan that was abandoned by the Austrians, was blown to the sky by the Tuscans. This super artillery has the longest range, largest caliber, and exaggerated power in the world. But what the Tuscans did not explain to the Egyptians was that the reason why Austria scrapped this weapon program was because of this thing. The explosion rate is astonishing. There was even a miracle of pentakill, including gunners, loaders, observers, a general who came to inspect, and the flag bearer responsible for guiding the direction. In that test firing, due to excessive gunpowder filling, the barrel exploded on the spot. No one around the artillery was spared, and a piece of artillery fragments flew backwards like a meteor and hit a general who came to inspect. The explosion caused the trajectory of the cannonball to change, and a huge cannonball flew over the flagman's head. Although it did not hit the flagman, it directly took away his soul. When people discovered the abnormality, he was already bleeding from all his orifices and died. The original intention of the design of the M1832 super artillery was to create the largest and most powerful artillery in the world. However, the artillery manufacturing technology and steel quality at the time could not support the ambitions of the Austrian military. As a result, this artillery had no stability at all, and it was almost impossible to fire. it would explode, so the military had to reluctantly scrap the plan 100 pound/50 caliber. This kind of data has almost caught up with the naval guns during World War I. Of course, the Austrians could not build them at this time. Even if they could be built, they could only be placed in fortresses, or mounted on warships within the Austrian army. This artillery was called the Hellbringer. However, as soon as this name was translated to the Egyptians were excited and prepared to name it the ultimate weapon point. Under the strong request of Egypt, Tuscany began to purchase the design drawings of the M1832 artillery from Austria. The Austrian side did not know what the Tuscans wanted to do. They only felt that this was a failed design and did not want this embarrassing design to be made public, so they rejected the Tuscans' proposal. However, this aroused the Egyptians' desire to buy. In the end, Austria sold the design drawings of the M1832 artillery. Because the Egyptians gave too much. The Austrian military felt they had made a huge profit by selling a completely useless blueprint for 100,000 florins. The Egyptians bought what they considered to be the ultimate weapon and felt it was a good profit point as an intermediary. The Tuscans received a 5% commission, which they felt was very profitable. When Ali Pasha got the design drawing of the M1832, he immediately asked Egyptian craftsmen to copy it. However, with the Egyptian technology, it was impossible to make such a large gun model, and Ali Pasha's order was absolute. Every day after the time limit was exceeded, kill one person and the whole family. As a last resort, Egyptian craftsmen came up with the oldest method, using clay molds. It stands to reason that this kind of thing cannot be done at all, but God favored these craftsmen and really allowed them to build a cannon. But the problem came again. The cannonball made of clay molds was uneven, which weakened the cannon. It is powerful and prone to explosion. So, they came up with a new method. The inner chamber was leveled with melted iron and the outside was reinforced with iron hoops. As for whether it could be launched and whether it would explode, only God knows. On the day of the test firing, Ali Pasha looked at the huge cannon in front of him and couldn't help but feel a sense of domineering. He decided not to hit the target he had set before, but instead pointed at a passing merchant ship. You must know that the artillery of this era may not be able to hit a fixed target. It is simply impossible to hit a moving merchant ship, not to mention whether this artillery can be fired is still a question point. But under Ali Pasha's order, the gunners could only turn their guns and aim at the moving merchant ships. The craftsmen on the side were even more worried. They were more worried than the gunners, because the gunners were only worried about missing the shot, but they were afraid that the gun would explode. If the gun exploded, their lives would be lost. However, good luck favored them again, and the artillery fired successfully. The huge explosion made the gunner's ears bleed. The cannonball hit the merchant ship without any bias, and something unexpected happened. After the merchant ship was hit, there was a huge explosion, which directly blew the entire ship into pieces. A bomb containing more than 100 kilograms of gunpowder is powerful, but it will never blow a merchant ship into pieces. In fact, this merchant ship was filled with flour, and when the huge explosive bomb exploded in the cabin, the dozens of tons of flour exploded like a bomb, instantly amplifying the power of the explosive bomb dozens of times. 100 times. The gunners and craftsmen were dumbfounded. They really didn't believe that any artillery could produce such power, but the fact that happened right before their eyes forced them to believe it. At this time, Abdul was the first to react and knelt down to salute Ali. Thank you, Allah, for giving my lord the divine sword. My lord will surely restore the glory of the Arab Empire. Thank you, Allah, for giving my lord the divine sword. My lord will surely restore the glory of the Arab Empire. All the soldiers and craftsmen around him knelt down. They all believed that this was a miracle, indicating that Ali would become the master of this world, and they would become the sword and shield in the hands of the master. However, Ali Pasha did not look at the prostrate crowd. He just looked at the bright fireworks with a sinister smile on his face. He named this cannon Hades on the spot. A raging fire burned in his eyes. This fire will burn to the Mediterranean, to Istanbul, to Albania, to London. Chapter 114. 3 years to modify, 5 years to build. Vienna, Royal Garden. Franz and Friedrich started a simulated war over plates and food. Friedrich was very interested in Franz's special operations. A small force took advantage of the darkness to paralyze the enemy's important forts, attack the enemy's arsenal, or prepare in advance in the enemy's city, to cooperate with the large force inside and outside, although it was a bit despicable. But it is indeed direct and effective. Point as for the tactics of steamships, they should focus on harassing and killing the crew. Point therefore, artillery should be installed at the bow and stern of the ship, to facilitate pursuit and escape. Point at the same time, the broadside firepower should be mainly based on explosive shells and grapeshot. The purpose is to kill the deck personnel of the enemy ship, ignite the deck, and destroy the sails, so as to cause chaos on the enemy ship. Point as for sinking and gang hopping, let's forget about it for the Austrian Navy. Point Venetian sailors are indeed very good at fighting, but if you expect a group of professional drunkards to deal with a group of professional soldiers, you should wake up. Point the main reason is that the current modified steam-powered ships are still too small to be suitable for these two tactics. In addition to running fast, steam-powered ships can also add additional armor to the outside, which is called ironclad ships. But there is a big difference between the ironclads of this era and the ironclads we will know in later generations. At this time, the ironclad ships were just an iron shell wrapped around a wooden hull. Some ships even had a few pig iron plates hung on both sides of the ship to protect against cannons. As for the source of power, it is also confusing. There are those that rely solely on steam power, and there are also those that are powered by steam and sail hybrids. Especially now, Austria's warships modified from merchant ships and cargo ships usually only have 500 to 1000 tons, which can only be regarded as a level of cruisers. They are really powerless in the face of battleships that often exceed 2000 tons. As for using this small boat to sink a 3,500-ton first-class battleship, it is even more impossible. Franz, I think what you said is very good. If the Marine Corps can really reach the level you mentioned, then the war will be too easy. Maybe we can complete it without losing even a single battleship. Fighting that the ancients could not even imagine. Friedrich wanted to flatter him, but his technique was poor, so Franz had to pretend to accept it. When will your steam battleship be launched, HMM? Friedrich thought for a while and said, 3 to 5 years. So long? Franz was a little surprised. In fact, he thought it was just a pile of wood and a layer of iron, and it should be about the same in a month or two. This is considered fast, but it still has to be built in Venice. If it is built in Trieste and there is a lack of experienced shipwrights, it may not be able to be launched in 5 years. Friedrich emphasized. Point Franz felt something was wrong and said, what level of battleship are you talking about? My flagship is, of course, a first-class battleship. Point I want to ask about the construction time of conventional capital ships. Looking at Friedrich's thoughtful look, Franz felt that the third-level battleship must not take so long to build, 2 to 3 years. Point is the construction speed so slow? Franz was still a little confused, unless, of course, you want him to sink in one shot. Friedrich laughed. Sink with one shot. Franz was a little confused, because when he chatted with Friedrich before, he knew that the most efficient way to sink a warship during this period was actually to hit it. Point it's just that a violent impact will most likely cause both parties to sink together. If you want to use artillery to sink the opponent's warship, it will be difficult to do it without half an hour of fighting, unless it is crushed by tonnage firepower. The Americans on the other side of the continent once built a third-class battleship named the US America to thank France for helping them get rid of British rule. However, due to cutting corners, it sank as soon as it arrived in France. Friedrich laughed and revealed the dark history of the United States. Point in fact, historically, on November 9, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the construction of 3 74-gun battleships. This was the first time that the United States independently built battleships, and the US America that Friedrich mentioned was among them. Point on September 3, 1782, the US Congress decided to donate the US America to France. Point on November 5, 1782, the hull was launched. Point on June 24, 1783, it was completed and set sail for France and arrived on July 16. In 1786, the French Navy inspected and found that the ship's wood had rotted and could not be repaired, so it was immediately scrapped. The Americans spent 6 years building a rotten ship and then gave it to the French, euphemistically calling it a gift. This is really the old American way, Friedrich. If we want to build 3 first-class steam-powered ironclads, how long will it take? God knows. I haven't even built one. You ask me how long it will take to build 3. Let's wait until my flagship is launched. Franz didn't know much about shipbuilding, so he could only ask Friedrich, but Friedrich didn't want to answer Franz's question at all, because he didn't have the answer either. What's even more embarrassing is that Franz rejected several of Friedrich's ideas, based on the experience of later generations, so the latter seemed a little irritable and eager to win back some face, but Franz was used to enjoying the convenience of later generations' networks. People are quite uncomfortable with the life of not being able to get answers as soon as possible, and the atmosphere at the dinner table seemed awkward for a while. Jenny saw something was wrong with the atmosphere in front of her, so she said, "Archduke Franz, you and Archduke Friedrich haven't had dessert yet. Why don't you let him try the double-skinned milk you invented?" Jenny deliberately walked between Franz and Friedrich and cleared the dishes on the table. "Double-skinned breasts? Franz, are you still a gourmet?" This is not because Friedrich is too out of the box and easily led astray by a Jenny point, but a Jenny is very good at handling this kind of thing. Her voice, expression, and body language can easily induce people to fall into her rhythm. It's just that she usually deals with jealousy between men rather than children's fights, but in her eyes there is actually no difference. I didn't invent it. It's a practice spread from the East. I just happened to read it in a book. Franz replied. In fact, since the day Jenny took charge of Franz's diet and daily life, sugar has never left Franz's menu. The food in Vienna itself is on the sweet side, and Jenny and Thalia hit it off when it comes to adding sugar, such as pork chops and syrup, ham in honey sauce, sweet cabbage, honey chicken soup, and coffee that is so sweet that it is more than lethal. If Franz doesn't prepare his own food to eat, he may develop diabetes early on. I really admire you for reading so many books. At your age, I only read Gaul Wars and Army Code of Conduct. It was obvious that Friedrich was sincere, but Franz really deserved it, because he was born into lives, and could do this. When he was 7 years old in his previous life, he was still watching Calabash and Cat and Mouse. No, you are very powerful. At least I haven't read Gaul Wars and Army Code of Conduct. I only read some casual books, Franz explained. Franz, actually I have always had a question. Where can we find people who can speak Arabic in our Austrian Empire? If we want to infiltrate secretly, we can't let our people speak German or Italian. Chapter 115. Give someone a rose, and the fragrance will linger in your hands. This is indeed a problem, but it is not a problem. Franz replied. Why is it not a problem? Not only are the languages, skin colors, and appearances different, but even if you learn Arabic, it is difficult to imitate their pronunciation, and it will be easy to be discovered. First of all, we can train Egyptians, or directly spend money to hire Egyptians and let them guard themselves. Of course, this is not a good way, because the risks and uncertainties are too great. Franz said, hiring Egyptians? This is indeed a good idea, but as you said, the uncertainty is too great. If they betray us when we attack, and stab us in the back, the entire Austria will be ruined. Navy, Friedrich said worriedly. Don't worry. Although we don't look like Egyptians and we don't speak Arabic, but we can pretend to be French. It's very easy to find dozens or hundreds of people in Austria who can speak French. Once Franz reminded him, Friedrich immediately responded, that's right. Even if our French pronunciation is inaccurate, those Egyptians can't tell, and we can send people to observe and learn from the French's words and deeds openly. If we want, we can be more French than the French in the eyes of the Egyptians. Franz smiled. Friedrich also laughed. Although Franz's idea was bad, he liked it very much. If fighting a war can benefit him, and others take the blame, then it shouldn't be too satisfying. At this time, a Jenny happened to come back with double breast milk. Seeing the two talking and laughing, she couldn't help feeling a little emotional that they were indeed two children. Thalia, on the other hand, was rather disdainful of Franz and Friedrich's methods. Her ideal war would be a group of brightly dressed knights launching an each charge and returning from the battle with food in their mouths with a rose. However, the war described by Franz and Friedrich was so dirty that they even studied what to throw into the opponent's well to pollute the water source as much as possible and weaken the enemy's will to resist. Archduke Franz, Archduke Friedrich, come and try it, I made it myself. Jenny said. In fact, in this era, chefs generally prohibited women from entering the kitchen to cook because it was considered an offense to the chef himself. However, Jenny is a kind of attractive woman, so the chef welcomes her. Secondly, desserts were not considered cuisine during this period. The mainstream view of this era was that women could cook, but not know how to cook. Therefore, Friedrich showed a skeptical attitude towards the food in front of him. Franz didn't care very much. He just picked up a bowl and tasted it. It tasted good, but why did this woman like to add butter? But I have to admit that Jenna's work is much better than Franz's half-finished product. Very good. Your dessert will definitely be praised by Mr. Fraser. Fraser is a Bohemian and the royal chef, responsible for the royal banquets and daily meals. Bohemia has produced many famous chefs in history, so in Austria, Czech chefs are the best chefs by default. Thank you for the compliment. Mr. Fraser has already praised me. Jenny replied. Does Fraser still weigh more than 200 pounds now? Friedrich asked. No, he is almost 250 pounds now. Franz replied. Friedrich and Franz both laughed. Friedrich picked up a bowl of double skim milk and said, I have to try a dessert today that can be praised by that fat man Fraser. In fact, Friedrich still looked doubtful. It is difficult to change the stereotype of an era. Until he ate it, it was soft and mellow, with clear layers and moderate sweetness. It was really unforgettable. Friedrich took a deep breath, looked at Franz, and then at Jenny, and strange thoughts suddenly flashed through his mind. Not bad, it's delicious. Thank you for your hospitality, Jenny returned the gift, and Thalia watched helplessly. Jenny walked up to Thalia, took out a bowl from the layer of her skirt, and whispered in Thalia's ear, this is for you. Thank you. Thalia looked very excited. Let's talk about your trip to Mexico. Franz said. Northeastern Mexico, port of Tampico. Most of the supplies have been transferred to Mexico City, and the rest are mainly weapons. Tazanana was afraid that, if these weapons were transported into Mexico City, it would cause a new rebellion. After all, he took the main force to fight the South Point. If someone instigates rebellion in Mexico City at this time, the civil war in Mexico will be endless. There are more factions in Mexico than the Americans imagine. Otherwise they would not put all their bets on Joe Sepula, including Gabriel, who has always been an ally of Tazanana and is opposed to Tazanana. Anna's reasons and strength. At this time, the northern part of Mexico was almost no man's land. The three largest states, California, New Mexico, and Texas, sold to France, had a combined population of less than 100,000. The central part is rich in mining, while the south relies on plantation, especially sugar cane and tobacco. Although the Spanish had been driven away, the royalists in Mexico were strong, and Tazanana was a republican. In fact, royalists value family background most. Tazanana's family background is obviously not noble enough. In addition, he is a Frenchman himself, and the person he admires most in his life is Napoleon, so he always feels that he can be like Napoleon, be the first consul, and then the emperor. As a result, a strange phenomenon occurred in Mexico. The royalists in the south wanted democracy, while the republicans in the north pursued authoritarianism. Every attack deployed by Tazanana before could be discovered by the opponent in advance. This is simply impossible. There is no doubt that there is a traitor on his side. After receiving the supplies and weapons from Austria, Tazanana simply led the army to forcibly attack the Cerro Gordo fortress. There is a huge gap between the strength of the rebels in the south and Tazanana's army. Under the strong attack of the government forces, the leaders of many factions of the rebels chose to protect their lives and surrendered to Tazanana one after another. Book, or leave the Cerro Gordo fortress with the troops. Sepula's troops were naturally unable to support themselves. He could only choose to abandon the fortress and evacuate to the south, using the vast southern plains to fight guerrilla warfare with Tazanana. However, Tazanana did not intend to give him this opportunity. He directly ordered the troops to plunder the property of the rebel families in the south, burn farmland, and hunt down the rebels. In order to completely eliminate the fighting spirit of the rebels, Tazanana directly ordered the soldiers to grab food, leaving only winter rations for each household. Those who did not want to starve to death could follow him to the north to open up wasteland. Tazanana's approach was very smart. He could suppress the rebels and immigrate to the border, but he unintentionally offended many people. At the same time, due to Tazanana's fire, the price of sugar in Europe unexpectedly increased, which in a sense saved Franz's pancreas. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 116, Jimmy's New Toy. Since ancient times, the cost of security warfare has been very high. The same is true for the Mexican Civil War. Epula and Tazanana successively launched massacres to eliminate the opposing forces, resulting in a total of nearly 500,000 deaths at this time. Mexico's population was only 7 million, compared with 17 million in the United States. The cost of a population of 500,000 was simply too high for Mexico. In comparison, even the more than 60 million francs owed by the French seemed insignificant. Joseph decided to surrender to Tazanana. He wanted to go into exile in France in order to make a comeback. However, Tazanana only pretended to agree to his conditions and secretly ordered Jimmy and his men to kill Joseph. Joseph boarded an American merchant ship. The ship's destination was the French port of Toulon, where it would take him to meet some French big shots and enjoy the treatment that a high-level political exile should have. At this time, France had taken back Texas, and the benefits from this colony were pretty good. However, from a security perspective, France had to take over the surrounding areas to ensure the security of Texas. In fact, this was France's North American policy that had been set long ago, but I didn't expect it to go so smoothly. Persimmons must be picked on the weak between the United States and Mexico. Mexico is of course the easy one to bully, and Joseph, the loser of the Civil War, applied for political exile in France. This is undoubtedly a problem for the French when they just want to sleep. Pillows were brought. However, neither the United States nor Mexico will let the French do what they want. On this US merchant ship, Joseph was attacked. Mexican masked gunmen who had already been ambushing the US merchant ship launched an attack on Joseph and his retinue. Caught off guard, Joseph's followers soon fell into a pool of blood, and Joseph himself was captured into a room hung with ham and bacon. Who are you? Who sent you? Joseph shouted. However, Jimmy ignored him and hung him directly on the meat hook. The sharp meat hook was inserted into Joseph's flesh, and his screams immediately echoed in the room. However, since his hands and feet were tied, he could only watch his muscles being torn apart by the meat hook crack. Who gave you the information? Jimmy asked. I don't know what you're talking about. Put me down, you bastard. Jimmy pressed the knife to Joseph's lips. I just want to know who told you the information. As long as I get what I want, I will let you live. Only a devil would believe your lies. I will pay you 10 times what Tazanana can give you. Joseph shouted. Suddenly Jimmy and the masked gunman in the room looked at each other and laughed. One of the masked gunmen removed his hood, revealing the face of a black man. You can't give us what we want. After Jimmy finished speaking, he began to take off Joseph's clothes. What are you doing? Damn it, you beasts. I don't know anything. Then, how did you get the strategic deployment of the Mexican army? Jimmy asked. What are you talking about? I don't know. Jimmy had stripped Joseph naked, lit a torch, and began to burn the hair on his body. Suddenly, Joseph screamed repeatedly, and Jimmy asked, "Are you willing to say it now? I'm a Mexican general." Now, he's nothing more than a traitor. Jimmy took out a knife and put on his reverse coat and apron. and Joseph immediately shouted, "What do you want to do? I told you I don't know anything." There is a proverb among the skinned Indian tribes: he who has no clothes has few secrets, and he who has no skin has no secrets. Is this true? Jimmy was smiling, but it was cold. 2 hours later, Jimmy stopped what he was doing, took off his bloody apron, and threw it into the trash can. At this time, a young man handed him a cigar. "What should we do now, Mr. Jimmy?" "Miss Jenny belongs to Mr. President." Jimmy took a deep breath, as if he had made a decision. "Our allegiance is to the boss, not the boss's woman." "I understand, Mr. Jimmy." The young man put on a pair of clean clothes and left the cabin. In fact, Jimmy was not very old, but his expression always looked very numb, so many people thought he was a veteran. "Mr. Jimmy, what should I do with this pile of rotten meat?" "Cut it up, throw it into a bucket of salt water, and let the Americans make it into bacon and sell it to the French." Jimmy and his group quietly left the cabin, leaving only a pool of blood, but no one cared that there was an extra package in their hands. Although Mexico put down the rebellion at this time, the death of 500,000 people greatly weakened Mexico's potential. Americans and French are all penetrating into the north of Mexico, and there are less than 100,000 Mexicans in the vast territory of northern Mexico. Tazanana's policy of forced relocation caused widespread dissatisfaction in Mexico, but he had no choice. If he did not do so, it would be equivalent to giving away the northern land, which he could not accept under any circumstances. The French expressed their willingness to send immigrants to open up wasteland in California and New Mexico. The French immigrants would not only open up wasteland, but also pay taxes to the Mexican government, but the tax rate could only be determined through negotiation between the two countries. The Mexicans are not fools, and know that this is a plan of the French, just like the original immigrants in the United States. Coupled with the negotiated tax rate, Mexico's national strength cannot ask France to do anything, but in turn, Mexico has to consider France's demands. If Mexico really agrees to tax rate negotiation, I'm afraid that it will even lose its tax autonomy in the future. The US government proposed to purchase from Mexico, California, and New Mexico. For this purpose, the US government is prepared to pay $15 million to the Mexican government, but it must be paid in full within 10 years. This is simply a joke for Mexico, which has an uprising every 3 months and a major coup every 6 months. Historically, Mexico had 50 governments in the 30 years from 1821 to 1850, and about 250 military coups occurred in the 24 years from 1824 to 1848 alone. Without the backing of France and Austria, Tazanana's presidential career might have ended long ago. Now, if Mexico wants to rely on its own strength, it cannot develop or defend the northern border. Franz also thought about sending people to California to mine gold mines secretly, but the problem came. The mining could be carried out secretly, but how to transport it back? No country wants Austria to get California's gold, and no one can guarantee that Austria's gold mined in California can be shipped back to Austria. And Austria and Mexico face the same problem, which is how to hold California. The Panama Canal was not open at this time. If you wanted to go from Austria to California, you would have to go around the entire South America, or park the ship in Mexico, change carriages, and walk overland for 1 to 2 months to California. However, this approach is obviously not very realistic. Tazanana's sudden immigration plan disrupted Franz's previous deployment. Some plans had to be implemented in advance, because no one could guarantee that the new Mexican immigrants would not discover California's secrets. Chapter 117. Three North American brothers. In Franz's eyes, Mexico has always been a big fat sheep. This country is home to the largest silver mine in the world, but due to graft and corruption, the government can only borrow money to survive. Various forces in Mexico usually refuse to give in on the ownership of silver mines, and large-scale armed fights often break out. It was said to be a battle with weapons, but its bloody and tragic level was no less than that of a small-scale war both sides gathered hundreds of gunmen, armed with artillery, to shoot at each other from a distance, and even local military police and troops were hired to join in. Point as a traitor. The righteous reason for mortgaging his valuable property to foreigners also silenced the factions in Mexico. Point after all, Tassiana was worried about finding someone to attack, and no one wanted to cause trouble for him at this time. Point of course. In order to prevent the Austrians from mining less silver mines, the Mexican army deliberately blew up the silver mines. The blame was naturally placed on General Epula. Point. Although Mexico has developed agriculture, food actually needs to be imported at this time, and when they learned about Austrian food prices, they decided to import it in the future. Point after the Mexican Civil War, agriculture suffered the most serious losses. Almost half of the farmland was burned. If it were not for Austrian food, hundreds of thousands of people in Mexico would have starved to death. Point. The Mexican Civil War is over, but the demand for arms has not decreased, because Mexico can clearly feel the pressure from France and the United States. Point. If it cannot have a well-armed and well-trained armed force, Mexico will lose a large area of territory, and may even become a vassal of other major countries, or even be annexed by other countries. The silver mines in Mexico were an eye-opener to the Austrian gold miners, and those in Tyrol were indeed poor compared to them. Point. Although Austria has the right to mine the silver mine, it still has to pay taxes to the Mexican government, and the tax rate is as high as 40%. Excluding personnel and mining costs, the income from the silver mine should actually be 50-50 between Austria and Mexico. As long as Mexico is still adjacent to France and the United States, it cannot give up developing bilateral relations with Austria, because the possibility of changing the political structure of the North American continent with its own power is extremely slim. Point. The war had just ended, but Texas in the hands of the French was prosperous under the behest of Gabriel, the French governor of Texas. Texas resumed the slave trade, and countless Portuguese slave traders transported ship after ship of slaves to the Gulf of Mexico. Point. Slave manors were built one after another in Texas, and even the new French immigrants fell in love with this way of life. After all, the land here was much more fertile and cheaper than in France. Point. The situation of the poor people from France was not so lucky. They were forced to live in black slave houses and worked endlessly every day. Any protest would result in a severe beating, and the overseers were actually American people. Point. Originally, France did not have high expectations for the new colony of Texas, because colonization requires money to be invested first, and it usually takes a few years to see the benefits. But this time it was different. Governor Gabriel shipped 30 shipments of supplies back to the country in the first year, including wheat and cotton, as well as 5 million francs in taxes. In fact, Governor Gabriel unintentionally ignited the slave trade in North America. As the plantation economy continued to expand, more and more slaves were needed. However, more and more areas banned the slave trade. Point. This resulted in an inversion of supply and demand, and the price of a black slave in the United States could reach as high as $1,500. Point. However, in Texas, due to the influx of a large number of slave traders, the price of a black slave was only $300. There were even Indians for sale, but the price for Indians was much lower, usually only $15. Americans have not learned from their previous experience in real estate speculation, and now they are speculating on black slaves again. Point. Because the black soldiers under Tassiana performed bravely in the Mexican Civil War, some local forces in Mexico also began to purchase black slaves in order to obtain a strong black army. Point. Due to the strong strength shown by France in fighting the US military, it successfully created a large number of American traitors. Many landowners and businessmen wrote to Governor Gabriel, saying that their ancestors were French, and they had always been proud of their French ancestry. Point. If one day Great France wants to regain its lost territory, they are willing to cooperate internally and externally, and work with the French heavenly troops to regain the lost territory. Point. Of course, Oklahoma and Louisiana have the largest number of these people. In fact, this is just a means of self-protection for landowners and businessmen. Point. As a result, these people tried every means to do business with the French, acting as if they were leading the way, and even paid for the French to build roads and hospitals in Texas. Some people can't understand why these people have to eat a pot of pulp to welcome the king's army. In fact, do you know that, if there is no such thing as a pot of pulp, once France and the United States start a war, the US military will not be able to resist it, and the French army will enter the United States. What will happen inside the country? Robbery. That's just routine. What is even more terrifying is a massacre like what France did in Spain. The French have always regarded North America as a land of barbarians, and the French have never been lenient in dealing with barbarians. Even Gabriel himself did not expect that he could independently meet the expenses of the French army stationed in Texas, and even pay taxes to his country. On the other hand, in the United States, due to the defeat of the war and the turmoil of the economic crisis, the entire country was enveloped in a mood of uneasiness and panic. Sales of southern cotton dropped significantly and were replaced by cotton from Texas and Egypt. The sudden appearance of France, a powerful neighbor, caused the number of US troops to soar from 15,000 to 52,000. However, the US military still felt that it was not enough. Because the previous war was too shocking to the American military, with its powerful firepower, steely discipline, and indestructible will. The strength of the French army was overly mythical by American deserters. However, what was most outrageously distorted was the strength of the French army. In order to save face and appear to be not so stupid, the US military insisted that the French had 20,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry in Texas. The US military's defeat was entirely due to the opponent's inability to talk about martial ethics, and the French army does not have high moral or strong will, but it is an army that has been poisoned by the ideology of feudal kingship. The New York Post published an article saying, "The French now are no longer the army full of justice and fearless spirit led by the Marquis de Lafayette. They are the impostor and despicable minions of Louis Philippe." Under pressure from the military, Martin Van Buren had to sign a presidential decree expanding the US army to 100,000. However, these 100,000 soldiers cost money, whether it is weapons and ammunition, or food, clothing, housing and transportation. Money is needed, and at this time, the United States just has no money. It's just that God's will seems to be there, and a sudden disaster saved the US economy. The two chapters of the meat grinder competition have been revised. If you have any bad points, you can point them out, and I will continue to revise them. Chapter 118 Heat. A sudden heat wave swept across Europe, with temperatures exceeding 40 degrees in much of southwestern Europe. Austria Vienna. The temperature in this city does not exceed 25 degrees all year round. The continuous high temperature of 35 degrees is a bit unbearable. Many people are too hot to sleep and have to wander outside until late at night before falling asleep. Franz was also uncomfortable in Schönbrunn Palace. The high temperature made him uncomfortable. After all, he had been in Vienna for 8 years, and he was used to wearing long shirts. In summer, Europeans don't have many ways to escape the heat. All they can think of is soaking in the water or finding a cool place to travel. As a result, Russia, which has always been regarded as a barbarian by Europeans, suddenly ushered in a peak of tourists, and wealthy Europeans fled to Russia to escape the summer heat. In the eyes of Nicholas I, this was an excellent opportunity. Just when you think this is the perfect opportunity to show off his hospitality, you're dead wrong. The iron-fisted Tsar's intention is to silence those who speak ill of Russia forever. The first to be unlucky were the Jews, followed by the French. Later, the Russians also lowered their nationality standards in order to generate income. Any foreigner who looked down on Russia would be treated with the iron fist of the Tsar. Regarding the fact that the Russians brutally slaughtered foreign merchants, Russian Jews said they were used to it. However, the Franz family did not travel. Mrs. Sophie originally planned to visit relatives at her sister's house to escape the summer heat, because Bavaria has a plateau terrain with low temperatures. However, Count Zussel, who went back to explore the route first, said that Bavaria is now hotter than Vienna, so Mrs. Sophie had no choice but to give up this plan. Franz was in his room, in front of 2 ice stoves, and Thalia and Ajani were fanning themselves hard. They were already sweating profusely, and even their clothes were soaked with sweat. Franz felt even hotter now. Franz simply developed an air conditioner driven by steam power. In fact, in 1834, Jacob Perkins of the United Kingdom had successfully developed a manually operated refrigerator that used ether as the working fluid and could work continuously. It's just that the power of this refrigerator is too small and the workmanship is too rough. Franz used the knowledge of later generations to make modifications and added a crank connecting rod system to connect to the steam engine. A steam-powered air conditioner is completed. Jacoby Perkins's refrigerator was okay for freezing 2 glasses of water, but it was a drop in the bucket for Franz's house of several hundred square meters. Moreover, the price of that refrigerator was too expensive. It actually cost 50,000 florins. This was a price that most nobles, including members of the royal family, could not accept. So Franz decided to make his own. After all, the principle is not very complicated. He uses ether to evaporate and absorb heat, and then uses an air compressor to make the ether flow from the high pressure area to the low pressure area. It is injected into the evaporator through the capillary tube. The pressure drops suddenly, and the liquid refrigerant it immediately turns into a gaseous state and absorbs a large amount of heat in the air through the heat sink. In this way, as the compressor continues to work, it can continuously absorb the heat at one end of the low pressure zone into the refrigerant and then send it to the high pressure zone for dissipation into the air, thus achieving a cooling effect. In the end, Franz spent 70,000 florins to complete the design, but he couldn't care less. When the cold wind blew out, he felt that everything was worth it. Franz wanted to install a steam engine next door downstairs. At first, Ajani and Thalia thought Franz was crazy about the heat. However, the moment the cold wind blew out, they fell. It's so cool, it's so comfortable. As a result, the two of them refused to leave Franz's room until they died. When Franz was getting ready to go to bed, he found that they had not left yet, so he had to look at the two of them. Thalia was the first to speak. Franz, I'm your tutor. In fact, you can also call me Annie. You often slept on my lap when you were little. Franz looked at Ajani again, and Ajani immediately explained seriously, Archduke. Franz, I'm your chamberlain, or bedroom maid. I'm supposed to serve you in your room. If you need anything, just tell me. After all, this is my duty. Although Ajani said so, she was currently lying on Franz's sofa, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. Thalia occupied Franz's table at this time. Franz looked at the two of them helplessly and said lightly, if you don't mind it, you can sleep on the bed. Before Franz had finished speaking, the two of them quickly crowded forward, squeezed Franz in the middle, and covered him with a quilt. In fact, Franz also had a camp bed, which was arranged by Mrs. Sophie herself. Although after Franz's repeated requests, Mrs. Sophie finally agreed to let Franz sleep on a soft bed, the camp bed was still left. Before Franz could continue speaking, Thalia and Ajani blew out the candles on both sides. Good night, Archduke Franz. Good night. In fact, what Franz was thinking was, how can I sleep? Southwest Europe, Spain. The two sides in the Spanish Civil War even had to call a truce to avoid the hot weather. The last Woodford attack was very successful, capturing the French Lieutenant General Pierre and wounding Count Sabie, while Espartero hesitated to move forward. Removed by the Queen Regent and replaced by Odet, a banker who had never fought in a war, but the French sent Henry Gratien Bertrand, a veteran who had participated in the Napoleonic Wars, and the army he led was also France's elite. It's just that fighting in mountains is really not the French's specialty. Although they have won successive victories against the Carolists, it does not help the entire war situation. Moreover, because of the hot weather, the morale of the soldiers was low. Even the old general himself fell into a coma due to heat stroke, and the French army had to retreat and cease the war. Continuous high temperatures have caused widespread drought. A drought that has not happened in a century has swept across Europe. France and Spain are experiencing constant wildfires. The money the French have spent on firefighting can already build several battleships. Hungry stones appear frequently in the German region. These hunger stones were sunk to the bottom of rivers in years of famine. Their reappearance also means that famine will come again. The falling water level of the Elbe River and the appearance of the starvation stone have caused panic throughout Germany. If you see me, please cry for me. This hunger stone records the catastrophe in 1616, and more languages on the hunger stone are like curses and epitaphs. 1473, 1616, 1654, 1666, 1746. 1790 and 1800 were all the years with the most hunger stones, and they were also disaster years in the history of the German region. Starved rocks are riverbed rocks that only emerge from the water when the water level is extremely low. These hunger stones are inscribed with historical low water years as well as various signs and warnings. Starving Rock is a hydrological landmark, a witness to drought, and is also considered an ominous omen. Within Austria. Frequent reports of starvation stones being found in various parts of Austria have been reported. The church jumped in on the fun and said, "This is a revelation." Chapter 119. In dire straits. As for the chaos in the church, Franz had expected it. If they had missed this incident, they would not be called idiots. The last time the starvation stone was discovered in Austria was during the Napoleonic Wars in 1800, when natural disasters claimed the lives of nearly 500,000 people in Austria. Austria is a country with a dense network of rivers, but this year there were a lot of fights over water. Lakes and swamps in Austria are even showing signs of drying up. Of course, for farmers, drying up of swamps is a good thing, as it saves them from pumping water when clearing wasteland. As a result, a large number of swamps have been developed into fields for these pioneers. They only need to pay a fee to the Austrian government to become the new owners of this land. The Austrian government strongly encourages land reclamation because it can increase food output and increase national income. However, as the drought continued, more and more places were experiencing water supply problems. This situation had not occurred for decades. For a time, the entire Austrian Imperial government was extremely busy. Coupled with the churches fueling the flames, the whole of Austria looked like it was in imminent disaster, so smart people had begun to hoard food. Although the current food price had been driven up by Franz, the facts that happened before them made them reluctant. Join in without holding your nose. Although the drought is very serious, it is not bad for Austria, because there are enough rivers. But other European countries are not so lucky. The most serious ones are of course Spain and France. French agriculture has been hit hard again, and food prices in Germany are also rising this year. Of course, smart French people have already started hoarding food. Because of the downturn in French agriculture in recent years, the French have always had the habit of hoarding food, so it is not a big problem to survive this year's crisis. Of course, other European countries are not doing well, including the high latitude United Kingdom, where forest fires occur frequently, and coal miners are even worse. Many of them suffocate to death in the mines. There were even a large number of heat-related deaths in southern Italy, and even the mosquitoes fled here. King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies was sitting at the table at this time, with reports presented by his officials in front of him. The people in the Two Sicilies are in urgent need of help. Now the farmers don't even dare to work in the fields for fear of being heated to death. I ask you to consider opening warehouses to release grain. Fart. Are these unruly people worthy? Ferdinand II slammed the report on the table. 9 months ago, he was still a wise king known for his freedom and open-mindedness until the people of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies fired cannons at Ferdinand II's palace, launching an uprising demanding that the king's rights be deprived of his power, and at the same time shattering all of Ferdinand II's illusions. He no longer felt free. Doctrine can save his country. Ferdinand II, who had a broken dream, turned to conservatives and became overeating like his ancestors. In less than a year, he became a fat man of 200 pounds. This time, instead of rescuing his people, he ordered his soldiers to seize the land of farmers who could not deliver food. It increased the country's income in the short term, but it also planted huge hidden dangers for his rule. The migration of mosquitoes from southern Italy to the north is a bitter experience for northern Italians, who have never seen such large and ferocious mosquitoes. In fact, Italy's warm and humid climate is conducive to the breeding of mosquitoes, and there were no effective insecticides at this time, so the number of mosquitoes in Italy quickly reached a terrifying level. The raging mosquitoes also brought the spread of malaria. People throughout Italy were panicked and asked the Pope to repellent mosquitoes. So Pope Gregory XVI went to St. Peter's Basilica to pray. On the day of the prayer, a tiger mosquito bit the Pope hard on the face. Pope Gregory XVI immediately stated that he had endured the disaster alone, and the next day he was infected with malaria and was unable to attend Mass. Europe is in dire straits, but things are going smoothly in North America. US grain exports are expected to double this year in Mexico. France signed grain purchase contracts with some farmers in the south. Of course, the price was definitely lower than what was on the market, but compared to farmers who grew other crops, they still made money. With the construction of American railroads, the United States' control over the West was strengthening, and the French and Mexicans were their biggest enemies before manifest destiny. American immigrants continue to illegally cross the US-Mexico border in search of their own land. This time, the Mexicans do not tolerate it, but catch and kill each one. This has escalated the conflict between the United States and Mexico. However, in the eyes of Americans, the real threat is the French. After the French obtained Texas, they continued to immigrate to Texas. Now the number of French in Texas has almost exceeded the number of local Americans. The French's Texas was not affected by the extreme climate. There was a large amount of virgin land here, which made the French excited. What excites the French even more is that not only does it produce cotton, it can also provide food for the local area. It is simply many times better than Algeria. As early as 1830, France sent troops to expedition to Algeria. On July 5th of the same year, France occupied Algeria. Algerian Governor Hussein offered Algeria to France without resistance, but was exiled. But the struggle of Algeria's indigenous Arabs and Berbers has never stopped. Louis Philippe was troubled by this. This war had lasted 8 years, while Texas was completely different. France received it very smoothly, and did not even encounter a little resistance. At the same time, it can bring huge returns to France, which further strengthens the French's North American policy. The number of French troops in Texas has reached 8,000. Of course, most of these soldiers are reclaiming wasteland and engaged in construction and the like. Although France is in dire straits, French people don't like to immigrate abroad very much. Therefore, even if the French government gives a very good immigration policy, there is no large-scale immigration wave. 20,000 people are really not enough for France with a population of 31 million. The plan of the French colonial authorities is to immigrate 100,000 to 200,000 people within 5 years, and then continue to purchase land in North America, to eventually recreate France in North America. However, the actions of the Americans aroused the vigilance of the French. The French felt that the Americans were targeting France with their crazy military expansion. After obtaining the consent of the British, the French decided to send an additional 20,000 troops to Texas. This would not only ensure the security of Texas, but also increase immigrants to reclaim wasteland. The proposal for additional troops received strong support from Louis Philippe, who had been promoted by the Americans as an imposter and an evil tyrant. In fact, this is just the propaganda needs of the Americans, but Louis Philippe cannot accept this. What he hates most is that some people question his unqualification to be the king. However, the proposal to increase troops was opposed by Texas Governor Gabriel because he felt that Texas was now in a special period and a special position. He was afraid that the influx of a large number of troops would alert the United States and Mexico, and that a large number of immigrants would most likely conflict with the locals. Chapter 120 How to Invest. The North American version of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms that was being staged at this time made Franz very satisfied, but everything could not go according to Franz's expectations. For example, now the United States has actually contacted Mexico, and the two sides have reached a secret agreement to jointly fight France. That is, no matter whether France attacks either side, the other side needs to launch an attack on Texas within a month. After defeating France, the United States and Mexico will use Austin as the boundary, and the United States will pay a redemption fee of $10 million to Mexico. Of course, what the Mexicans didn't know was that Martin van Buren had signed a similar agreement with the French. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. What? Those two women didn't leave Franz's room all night. Mrs. Sophie looked very angry. The already muggy weather only added fuel to Mrs. Sophie's fire. Zussel, prepare the carriage, Count. Zussel was the only person in the room who didn't look tired. However, it still took a certain amount of courage. To go out at noon point he grabbed a glass of ice water from the table and drank it in one gulp, the ice cubes crunching in his mouth point. When they arrived at the downstairs of Franz's palace, Mrs. Sophie did not use the help of the maid, but rushed up the stairs by herself, holding up the hem of her skirt point in the room. Thalia and Ajani were helping Franz handle the files. Franz's layout was too large, and there was no network, so it was impossible for one person to handle it. Franz was still drawing around on a map, occasionally asking Ajani and Thalia to help find some information. The moment the angry Mrs. Sophie opened the door, a gust of cool breeze hit her, which made her so comfortable that she couldn't help but let out a cry. Her whole body softened, and her words were not very violent. "What did you do in Franz's room? Why didn't you leave during the night?" Ajani also wanted to say that she was Franz's bedroom maid, and it was her duty to stand by her master's side at night. But Thalia pointed directly to a machine on the wall that was blowing out cold air, and Mrs. Sophie understood immediately. "Franz, did you do this?" "Mother, this is Mr. Doubler and I." And before Franz finished speaking, he was interrupted by Mrs. Sophie. "Have you applied for a patent?" "Well, not yet," Franz replied. "Then why don't you apply quickly?" Mrs. Sophie glanced at Ajani, who immediately reacted and left with a pile of documents and design drawings. Madame Sophie wanted to take out her fan to fan herself, but found that it was totally unnecessary. "Franz, how much did this machine cost?" 70,000 florins, mother," Franz answered. Franz's words directly choked back Mrs. Sophie's words. Madame Sophie originally wanted to install one in her room, but now it seems she might as well forget it. 70,000 florins is too expensive, but she is not an ignorant woman. She knows Franz's machine, and it doesn't matter. "I know it's much better than Queen Anna's 50,000 florin ice machine." Thalia made a cup of tea and brought it to Mrs. Sophie with her head lowered. Although the rude behavior just now was an unintentional mistake on her part, if Mrs. Sophie were held accountable, she would definitely be severely punished. "Grand Princess, please have tea." Mrs. Sophie picked up the teacup and found it was a little hot, so she poured it directly on Thalia's chest. Then she took out a handkerchief and wiped it for Thalia. While wiping it, she said in a very gentle tone, "Really, why are you so careless? This time it was tea. Next time it might be boiling oil." As someone close to Franz, you should be more careful. "Go to my room. There is new tea that just arrived this year. Let Archduke Franz have a taste." Thalia ignored the tea leaves still hanging on her chest and immediately stood up and bowed to go to Mrs. Sophie's room to get the tea leaves. After Thalia left, Count Zassel closed the door outside. Franz was about to speak when he was interrupted by Mrs. Sophie. "If you don't want me to discipline your people, you'd better discipline them. Otherwise I'll use boiling oil next time. I mean what I say." "Mother, you are too strict. It's so tiring to do this. Why bother?" Franz rubbed against Mrs. Sophie like a baby. "Silly boy, I do it for their own good. By your side, any shortcomings in their bodies will be magnified infinitely. You are destined to become the emperor. If they are not qualified for their jobs, they'd better replace them in advance, rather than being the scapegoat when the situation gets out of hand." Mrs. Sophie pinched Franz's cheek and said dotingly, "What did you do last night? Why are the dark circles under your eyes so serious?" "What else could he do?" Squeezed between the two of them, used as a pillow when it was cold in the second half of the night and the temperature rose in the morning, so Franz was pushed away in disgust. After a night of tossing, "Franz, of course I didn't sleep well lately. I've been thinking about investing." "Speaking of investment, Franz, I have good news and bad news. Which one do you want to hear first?" asked Mrs. Sophie. "The good and bad news all stem from the same thing. I know that the weather this year is too hot." "Yes, the good news is that food prices have risen, and the bad news is that Austria is experiencing a rare drought." "Franz, is there anything you can do?" Franz shook his head and sighed. "No, even if there were, the price would be too high. All we can do is try to stabilize food prices and help the poor when necessary." Madam Sophie also sighed. "May God bless them." "Amen, mother. With the money from selling the grain, I hope to buy some wasteland in Hungary to resettle the poor." "Why In Hungary, there is still a lot of wasteland in Alitania, so why buy land in Hungary now? That land in Hungary is cheap, and the wasteland in Natalina will be developed sooner or later. Where will we have the land to continue to house refugees? Mrs. Sophie was a little confused. In fact, European countries were very repulsive to refugees at this time, because they were always the source of turmoil. The usual way that big countries solve the refugee problem is to throw them into colonies, to fend for themselves. Austria obviously does not have this condition. Of course, if Hungary can be regarded as a colony, then the problem will be much easier to solve. Placing the refugees on the wasteland purchased by Franz will not only allow them to reclaim the wasteland, but also solve the problem of the livelihood of these refugees. This will alleviate the social unrest caused by the refugees. After all, who has enough to eat? You have to want to rebel. As for the conflict between refugees and Hungarians, France is happy to see it end, because both parties can ultimately only rely on the Austrian government to resolve it. In this way, Austria can take the initiative on the Hungarian issue. When the railway is built to Hungary, maybe the Hungarian issue can be resolved peacefully. Yes, due to the influence of the German customs union, our country's ties with the German states have been greatly strengthened. At the same time, our country has no reason to prevent subjects from the German states from entering Austria. As for this disaster and the possibility of a refugee flow, you have to be prepared for this. Chapter 121 Royal Territory. Did the two of them do anything strange to you last night? Mrs. Sophie asked cautiously, perhaps for fear of hurting Franz's self-esteem. No. Franz showed an obviously impatient attitude. It was obvious that he knew what Mrs. Sophie was talking about. But Mrs. Sophie was not reassured and asked again, then, you didn't do anything weird to the two of them? Franz was speechless for a while. When Thalia returned, she found Madame Sophie asleep on Franz's bed. It seems that in the continuous high temperature weather, no matter who it is, the quality of sleep is greatly affected. Thalia, if you are in a bad mood, you can go to the academy to see more. Palace life is still too depressing for you. The academy will open next year at the latest, so you can pay more attention. I have given you permission to pass. Let mother write it. Franz handed the pass to Thalia. Thalia was still very excited, because being an official had always been her dream, but she was not happy. Franz didn't pay too much attention to Thalia. He had always had very low requirements for Thalia, because Thalia was his only helper and his only friend in the past. In the past, many things that Franz could not do directly had to go through the hands of Thalia. But now Franz has his own attendant. Although the loyalty of this attendant is not yet known, his ability is still the same. Nothing to say. As Franz grows older, there will be more and more people around him, and Franz's layout is too big. Thalia and Ajani are both very outstanding women, but they want to assist Franz. CI is still a lot worse. What Franz needs is a complete team and professional talents. After the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna opens, Thalia may be able to provide Franz with some talents, but of course that will only happen in a few years at the earliest. As for whether or how many talents can be provided, Franz doesn't know yet, and he doesn't care. After all, this is just one of the many big nets he has cast. The most severely affected by drought in the Austrian Empire was Hungary, but there was no trouble among the Hungarian nobles at all. In fact, the drought in Hungary is a good thing for Hungary's large landowners, because serfdom has lagged behind the times. The real nobles have long adopted a new model. They hired professional farm agents from Austria to take care of the farm for them. The crops grown are no longer simple wheat and rye, but a rotation system is adopted to grow fodder in addition to grain, as well as corn, rapeseed, sugar beets, sunflowers and potatoes, instead of a single grain crop. At the same time, large-scale mechanization has also greatly reduced the demand for agricultural labor. A skilled worker with 2 donkeys and a harvester can complete the work of 50 serfs in a day. Agriculture in Hungary during this era was extremely rough. Dirty, earthy smelling Hungarian grain and greasy dirty wool of varying lengths were rarely seen on the market, and could only be sold cheaply. The utilization rate of cultivated land is low. Due to poor market sales, 1/3 of the cultivated land has been idle for many years. There is also a large amount of land suitable for farming that is artificially prohibited from being reclaimed and used as hunting grounds for nobles. In addition, due to the impact of Austria's joining the German customs union, Hungary can hardly make any money from food, so it is better to grow some cash crops such as sugar beets. Farmers harvest crops with sickles, thresh grains with horse-drawn rollers, and hide grains in cellars. This place is no different from the Middle Ages. Starvation of serfs was a felony in Austria, but peasants were not protected by this law. That's why there was such a bizarre scene where Hungarian landowners encouraged serfs to escape and then paid to hire landless peasants. So, in order to save costs, the great nobles drove the serfs into bad land that was not suitable for large-scale production and left them to fend for themselves. As for the methods of annexing land, they are also very simple and crude. For example, instead of collecting taxes in kind, farmers are required to pay in money point, or they may first forcibly purchase farmers' crops at low prices, and then require farmers to pay taxes in kind. If they fail to pay, they will impose high fines. Or they may require farmers who grow grain to pay for cattle and mutton meat, and so on. In this way, the great nobles could acquire large tracts of land and turn landed peasants into their farm laborers. It is not only the free peasants who are persecuted by the big nobles, but also the small nobles. They are simply unable to resist agricultural risks. As long as there are a few agricultural fluctuations, they will become the so-called single-clothed nobles. What makes the great Hungarian nobles hate the most is their obligation as slave owners. They must treat the serfs when they are sick. They must provide relief to the serfs when they suffer disasters. If a serf dies of starvation, they must be severely punished and even have to set aside enough money. The woodlands and pastures were used by serfs to cut firewood and graze livestock. If this natural disaster could be used to get the serfs to give up their identities, it would be of great help to them. But why did the great nobles oppose the emancipation of serfs? Because the Austrian government is not a fool. It has long stipulated in the law that liberated serfs must receive a share of land. Because serfs will definitely not be able to survive without land. If a large group of people who cannot survive are allowed to wander within the country, there will only be one final result, and that is a peasant uprising. Austria, which has experienced the Hussite War, does not want to experience it again. For Hungary's big landowners and nobles, once the land is distributed to farmers, it will be difficult for the farms to be connected together for large-scale production. The so-called redemption policy of the Austrian Empire was as far-fetched as the debt of the Austrian Empire. The serfs simply could not afford to pay it off in one lump sum, which often took decades. Another very strange thing about Hungary is that until World War II, they still had large areas of uncultivated wasteland. This is why after the Soviets took over, Hungary's agriculture experienced a miraculous six-fold increase. The price of Hungarian wasteland is frighteningly low, but due to various reasons such as policy and ethnicity, ordinary people simply do not dare to buy land in Hungary, and even if they do, they dare not go there. However, the Franz family status is very special. Even if they purchase land in Hungary, there will not be any indifferent officials to tell them what to do, let alone any robbers who want to invade the royal territory. For example, Vojvodina was once an area full of mourners, hungry people, bandits and wild beasts. However, after Austria took over Vojvodina in the early 18th century, Vojvodina, a royal territory, became one of the richest regions in the entire Balkans. Franz wanted to buy land in Hungary and establish a royal estate. This would not only solve the refugee problem, but also increase food production. Why not? What's even more strange about Hungary is that not only are there a lot of wastelands, but there are even many wastelands that have no owners. These wastelands belong to Hungary, but not to the King of Hungary. So Franz still needs a little help, such as a nobleman willing to claim these wastelands and sell them to the royal family. There are no updates today. Chapter 122 István Széchenyi. István Széchenyi was a Hungarian born in Vienna on September 21, 1791. His father was an enlightened nobleman, and his family had been loyal to the Habsburg family for generations. Széchenyi once joined the army, participated in the anti-French war, and personally experienced the Battle of Leipzig. HNIE clearly felt that the era of cavalry was over, and cavalry without infantry would be miserable wretches, just like Marshal Ney and his poor cuirassiers, if the Hungarians went to war with Austria. They would only die in vain like those brave French cavalry. Moreover, the gap between Austria and Hungary is not comparable to that of the French army and the anti-French alliance, because even in a cavalry battle, Hungary is not sure of victory. In addition, there are many forces opposing Hungary and the Kingdom of Hungary. The most important thing is that after Hungary becomes independent, it will have to face the surrounding powers alone. So he always feels that opposing Austria is asking for death. After the war, HNIE traveled in Europe. He saw the power of Britain, France and other countries, and also saw the crux of Hungary's problems. HNIE published Credit in 1830, which can even be regarded as a template for Napoleon III's subsequent reform of French agriculture. The establishment of small long-term loans specifically for farmers was one of the driving forces behind French agricultural reform. Counts HNIE has always practiced his teachings. In 1825, he established the Hungarian Academy of Sciences to develop new technologies and promote new ideas. He demanded the abolition of hereditary laws, the greatest obstacle to credit. HNIE realized that, in order to modernize Hungary's agriculture, serfdom must be abolished and proposed the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of guilds and price limits, to make handicrafts more prosperous. The prosperity of a nation cannot be separated from a large number of educated talents, and HNIE regarded education as a major reason for promoting national prosperity. So he funded the establishment of the Academy of Sciences, restored the Hungarian language, promoted the development of science, and promoted the development of society. Of course, Hungarian was the worst language he could speak. He advocated that Hungary must develop its economy, blamed the country's disasters on the nobility, and urged them to abandon their feudal privileges. That's what HNIE did. He built many roads, improved transportation on the Danube so that ships could reach the Black Sea, and built the first bridge over the Danube in Budapest. All his net worth was invested. In 1839, construction of the HNIE chain bridge would begin, and he was the first to connect Buda and Pest. After Austria joined the German customs union in 1834, HNIE became even more convinced that he was right. Austria's economy took off immediately without Hungary, while Hungary's economy was in a miserable state without Austria. HNIE once became one of the leaders within Hungary. He demanded that Hungary join the German Zollverein for economic development. His proposals had a large following, but soon a more radical reformer emerged. He was once just a lawyer in Kossuth, but in Pozsony he suddenly thought of the idea of issuing a communique, and vigorously advocated Magyar autonomy and rule over the ethnic minorities in the newspaper. His newspaper immediately caused a sensation, and became very popular. From then on, Kossuth's reputation was out of control, and his fierce reform rhetoric also gained him a large number of fans. After all, HNIE's reforms seemed too cautious at the same time. The great nobles also opposed HNIE, an outlier, and hoped that Kossuth could be used to suppress HNIE. Moreover, according to past experience, passionate people like Kossuth were more likely to be controlled by them. At this time, HNIE also felt that he was being marginalized. He was very excited when he was invited by the royal family, because he had always hoped for a top-down reform. However, after arriving in Vienna, he was a little disappointed. It turned out that the royal family only wanted to purchase land in Hungary. In HNIE's mind, royal families usually purchase land to build manors and villas, and he thinks this time will be no exception. However, this time Mrs. Sophie made a request to purchase 300,000 hectares of land. Based on the lowest price of 5 florins per hectare, Mrs. Sophie needs to come up with at least 1.5 million florins at a time. After deducting 40% of the 1.5 million florins paid to the Hungarian government, the remaining 900,000 florins can be said to be earned in vain. HNIE did not have to pay any price, but just use the wasteland. The ownership is only given to Mrs. Sophie. The signing, the transaction, everything went very smoothly. HNIE seemed a little unbelievable that the money he had spent for so many years was actually earned back in one day. In fact, Count Zhnie also specially prepared gifts for Mrs. Sophie and the 3 Grand Dukes. These gifts cost him a total of 9,000 florins, and now it seems that he is a little unable to afford them. Grand Duchess, I have a heartfelt request. I hope you can find a way to promote Hungary's reforms and allow Hungary to join the German customs union. Hungary cannot do without Austria, and Austria cannot do without Hungary. Both countries are loyal to Habsburg. Fort family. In the minds of Hungarians at that time, Hungary and Austria were 2 countries, but they were loyal to the same emperor. Mrs. Sophie said with a smile as she opened the folding fan. You shouldn't say this to me. You should say it to the men of the Habsburg family. Even if you don't want to talk to them, you should go to the Prime Minister to talk to them. I'm afraid I can't help with this kind of national matter. Aren't you the only man in the Habsburg family? Zhenie cursed in his heart. He felt helpless when he thought of the famous idiots in the Habsburg family at this time. Emperor Ferdinand I, the Emperor's brother Archduke Franz Karol, the Emperor's uncle Archduke Louis. Although Zhenie was full of complaints in his heart, he still looked very humble on the surface. Count Zhenie felt that he could use his trump card to impress her with his talents. Count Zhenie took out several books from his bag and lined up his masterpieces one by one. What is this? Mrs. Sophie was a little curious as to what the man in front of her was going to do. These are all books written by me. Please read them one by one. Mrs. Sophie really wanted to roll her eyes at him on the spot, but considering her own image and cultivation, she held back. Mrs. Sophie took a book casually, flipped through 2 pages, and then said something casually. It's very well written. You are very talented. Upon hearing Mrs. Sophie's compliment, Zhenie suddenly felt that an opportunity had come. Then, you must understand what I mean. As long as you do what I say, the Austrian Empire will definitely regain its glory, and the people of the entire country will be grateful to you, madam. Sophie was tired of the blabbering lunatic in front of her. She waved her hand and 2 guards came forward and said to Count Zhenie, the Grand Duchess is tired. Count Zhenie, please come back. I'm not finished yet. The 2 guards did not pay attention to Count Zhenie's words and directly carried him out and threw him outside the palace gate. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 123. Passing by. A man named Gushon Cass wrote an anonymous letter reporting Archduke Franz's misdeeds. This letter actually got into the hands of Mrs. Sophie, which shocked her. She was shocked that she had such stupid people under her command. Who brought this letter? A maid she had brought from Bavaria stood up. Grand Princess, this letter is entrusted to me by my uncle. You can go back to Bavaria. Madame Sophie turned to Count Hustle and said, find the person who wrote the letter and break his legs. Gushon Cass was the former wine cellar steward who neglected his duties. After being fired by Franz, he held a grudge and wanted to teach Franz a lesson and get his own position back. Mrs. Sophie gave him a severe punishment, but Gushon Cass did not back down. Instead, he later became a liberal fighter and even became friends with Alexander Bach. Note, Alexander Bach, a famous liberal fighter in Austria, firmly opposed all policies of Prince Metternich and advocated a constitutional monarchy. Franz watched Zhenie leave from the window and did not come into contact with this pioneer who once campaigned for the rise of the Hungarian nation, because it was he who opened Pandora's box and led Hungary into the abyss of civil war. Hungary's agricultural problems are more complex than Zhenie thought. With the deepening specialization and commercialization of modern agriculture, its reliance on capital has also become stronger. The big nobles and big landowners established agricultural associations, but kept farmers out because they did not want the poor to master these technologies. This should be regarded as an early technical barrier. The land of ordinary farmers is too small and too scattered. They have no time to improve seeds, and no money to buy new technologies and agricultural machinery. They even have no channels to buy chemical fertilizers. The money they earn is just enough to survive. Life point. As for borrowing money, there were no specialized bank loans at this time, only Jewish usury point. Everyone must understand what loan sharking is, and everyone knows the risks involved, and farmers are the most risk-averse group of people in the world point. If it was just a matter of money, wouldn't Franz just gather a group of wealthy people to set up a specialized agricultural bank? However, relying solely on capital cannot solve Hungary's problems, because the big nobles and big landowners not only control capital, but also control huge rights and social resources, and can even influence laws and taxes. The nobles in some areas have territorial jurisdiction. A century-old poison cannot be eliminated overnight. As for Kossuth, he is just a clown who emerged at the right time. He can neither solve the land problem in Hungary nor unite the ethnic minorities in Hungary. There is absolutely no point in assassinating him. He was supported by the big nobles and big landowners, so he would naturally not take action on the land issue in Hungary, and the extreme nationalism for which he was famous made it impossible for him to treat the ethnic minorities in the country equally. It is much better to keep the greatest Hungarian than to kill him, and usher in an uncertain future. Royal Academy for Women in Vienna. Doppler and a group of physicists are debugging air conditioners with better performance. This is certainly not Franz's plan to make a living selling air conditioners from now on. After all, this kind of extreme weather does not happen every year. What Franz values is the future of air conditioners' important role in industry. These include making explosives and industrial printing to ensure the normal operation of precision instruments. Of course, the main function at present is just to make yourself more comfortable. Another good news is that the high-yielding wheat hybrid experiment was finally successful. What made Franz even more excited was that the man who successfully cultivated hybrid wheat was named Mendel. I have heard of Franz, the famous name of Peter Mendel. Although his theories were a bit advanced, Franz never felt that these advanced theories were useless. At least they laid the foundation for the advancement of agriculture and medicine. Theoretical basis. But what disappointed Franz was that what he saw was not a fat priest, but a standard Austrian farmer. Thin, somewhat hunched, and always with a flattering smile. "Ah, you Father Mendel?" "No, Grand Duke. As you can see, I'm a gardener, Heinzadorf Mendel." The farmer smiled honestly. "Mr. Mendel, would you consider staying as a gardener in my manor? You should have already received the bonus of 20,000 florins. I believe you should know that I'm not a stingy person." After Franz finished speaking, old Mendel was stunned. What he got was obviously 4,000 florins. The deacon clearly said that the Grand Duke had reduced the bonus, but 4,000 florins was still important to old Mendel, a gardener. It was a huge sum of money, but he didn't take it too seriously. Now why does the Grand Council say it is 20,000 florins? Old Mendel was not a fool, and he quickly understood the key point. Franz also knew how bad the officials, housekeepers and the like in this era were, but it was very disgusting that they had to rely on these people many times. Now that Franz has figured out the details of this manor and found a replacement, he now wants to see if he needs to give the former deacon some dignity. Archduke Franz, your generosity is surprising, but your deacon is not generous. I only received 4,000 florins. It was originally agreed to be 5,000 florins, but before the bonus was distributed, your deacon said that you had cut the budget. There's only so much left. Old Mendel spoke frankly, but out of a bonus of 20,000 florins, he actually embezzled 16,000 florins. This deacon was really a hopeless scumbag. "Mr. Mendel, do you have any evidence?" Franz asked, pretending to be casual. "Archduke Franz, here is the receipt for the bonus. Please take a look." Old Mendel said, "This scumbag is still so careless despite having both stolen goods and stolen goods. I really don't know how he survived all these years." Franz turned to look at the deacon. "Do you have anything else to say?" "No, give Mr. Mendel his money back and then leave, or I'll have Mr. Parrish send you to the gendarmerie and do a good inventory of your property." The deacon was still not convinced that he had stolen the stolen goods and was caught, but he was not as persistent as Gush and Cass, because Franz's punishment was already very light, so he happily returned the 16,000 florins. Mendel then quietly left. In fact, Franz did not want to be punished so lightly, but as long as he had some relationship with the royal family, the interest relationship was so complicated that Franz was disgusted by it. For example, the deacon's uncle was the butler of Prime Minister Metternich. His grandfather was once the royal steward Mr. Mendel, won't you consider my proposal, Archduke? Franz, I'm very grateful for your generosity, but my wife was ill before, and I owed a large sum of money for this. Now I want to pay back the money to those kind people first. What happens after that? I want to build a house, buy some land, hire 2 servants, and let my wife live a good life for a few days. She gave birth to 5 children for me, but she never had a good life. Then I will give my wife a good life. My younger sons are all sent to school, and my eldest son wants to learn a craft from me, so that he can inherit the family business, and prepare a good dowry for his daughter. This is the dream of a simple farmer. Franz is unwilling to break his peaceful life, and he is not the Mendel he is looking for, so he might as well bless him. Chapter 124 Destiny, Sorrow. Prussia, Berlin. The continuous high temperature made William III, an old man who was nearly 70 years old, less energetic than before. At this time, the problems faced by Prussia did not allow him to rest. Karl von Wielich held a thick stack of documents from newspapers all over Prussia. His Majesty, say, I'm not dead yet. A large number of hunger stones appeared in the Rhineland, and food grabbing occurred from time to time. The mob even clashed with the local military police. Damn it. These shameless mobs. What can a few broken stones say? Go tell them that the country has plenty of food, more than they can eat. Yes, Your Majesty. But if the disaster continues, the harvest in Prussia may also fail, and the country may also be short of food. Wielich explained. William III remembered the words of Friedrich List and said, these damn borers. They just know how to eat. It doesn't matter if our country's grain harvest fails, Russia will not be affected. If there is a famine, go to Russia to buy. But, Your Majesty, Wielich wanted to say something else, because the French were also buying food everywhere, and the French's behavior might affect Prussia's plan, but he was interrupted by Friedrich List as soon as he opened his mouth. Prime Minister Wielich, hasn't Your Majesty made it clear enough? Your Majesty is tired and needs to rest now. If you have nothing else to do, you can leave. Friedrich List was originally found by Weinrich, because Weinrich thought he was a talent, but now this guy actually got on top of him, which made Weinrich feel very unhappy. After Wielich left, Friedrich List took out a bottle of highly concentrated opium wine. Just opening the lid made William III's eyes light up. Mr. Lister, this wine is really magical. Just opening the lid can make people's eyes light up. It's much more effective than those bullshit doctors' medicines. That's natural. German doctors don't know how to treat. This is shipped from England. It is said to be more precious than gold. You will feel energetic after drinking this. Friedrich List poured a large glass, and William III drank it in one gulp. After that, he took a deep breath, and felt much clearer, and even the heat on his body dissipated. It's amazing. William III exclaimed, Britain is the most powerful country in the world. They have the strongest army and the strongest technology in the world. Even medical technology is the best in the world. We in Prussia still have a long way to go, so we can't lose you leadership. Wilhelm III took great advantage of Friedrich List's flattery. It's really ridiculous that the Austrians let a family of fools rule. It's really ridiculous that outstanding talents like you are kicked out. Such a miracle medicine is actually considered a drug. It's really ridiculous that you have to be entangled with those church bastards all day long. Indeed, the Austrians are short-sighted and unwilling to accept new things. Prussia's destiny is to unify Germany. That's right. Unify Germany. Mr. List, let's drink. Good. Cheers to Prussia, to Germany, to your health, to wine glasses filled with opium wine collided, and the orange-yellow liquid spilled out. France. Compared with the food issue, there is one thing that has reached the level of burning. It is a real fire. At this time, fires broke out every day in France. The wildfires in the southwest even caused 3,000 casualties. However, what made the French even more distressed was that the wildfires burned a large amount of precious oak. These oaks are good materials for shipbuilding and are extremely precious in this era. The disastrous defeat of Lieutenant General Pierre also sounded the alarm for the French. You must know that the arrogant Napoleon Empire fell into the mud pit of Spain. But Spain was too important to France, and neither Louis Philippe nor Prime Minister Thiers could refuse the temptation to unite Spain. The high temperature in Spain now gives the Carolists a breathing space, and it is also a good thing for the French, because they do not have to invest too much energy in Spain. Because France's energy is involved in Egypt, Algeria, Spain, Texas, and many colonies. The French Algerian expeditionary force was overwhelmed by the constant uprisings of the Algerians and the tribes that were difficult to conquer. Although almost every battle ended in victory for the French, this exhausting battle left the French with no sense of their own victory. What France thought of at this time was to build forts along the highway, besiege them for a long time, and divide and encircle them. Later generations of Japanese also learned this method of warfare, but the Algerians at that time did not have weapons such as grenades and mortars. Although the French bunkers were all defective, the Algerian rebels and tribal armed forces just couldn't take them down. Fortunately, Algeria was large enough. The French have been fighting this security war in Algeria for 20 years, and the cost can be imagined. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali was not a peaceful man, he was very ambitious. The French also knew this very well, but at this time the French always believed that they could participate in the frenzy of carving up the Ottomans through Egypt. Another point is that Egyptian cotton is too important to France. The French invested too much in Egypt, but were tied to their own tanks by the Egyptians. Although Ali Pasha vowed that he could defeat the British, the French were more inclined to negotiate peace with the British. After all, the British were too powerful. To negotiate peace with Britain, the French must have sufficient capital, which is a powerful navy. At this time, France had 6 first-class battleships, 7 second-class battleships, and 10 third-class battleships. This was already the second most powerful naval fleet in the world, but it was not enough to scare the British. You must know that the British Navy, which will fight the enemy when it sees it, has a record of defeating more with less on several occasions. As for the British Navy, it has never lost a battle in which it has the upper hand. So at this time France planned to build a group of powerful battleships, including the famous Varmy. French Varmy length x width x draft equals 64.05 meters x 18.11 meters x 8.61 meters. Full platoon of 5,826 tons, 1,100 crew, and 120 guns. It is expected to be equipped with 66 30-pound cannons, 50 30-pound Caron guns, and 4 18-pound cannons. If the Varmy is successfully launched, it will become the most powerful sailing battleship of this era. In fact, the sailing battleship, 3,500 tons, is where wooden materials can be used to their full potential. Once this weight is exceeded, the space of the battleship will become smaller, and the firepower will not be enhanced. Moreover, due to the weight problem, the sails will not be able to provide sufficient power, and the battleship will lose the maneuverability it should have. However, battleships of more than 5,000 tons have always been pursued by all countries as a symbol of force. Face is sometimes more important than actual function. The workers' problem in France was basically controlled by Guizot's tolerant policy. However, through investigation, they came to a strange conclusion. That is, someone has been supporting the French workers' movement, and this was directed at the British. Chapter 125 Achilles heel. London, England. Britain is the first country to complete the Industrial Revolution and is known as the world's factory. In order to reverse the inherent pirate image of Britain that Europeans have had for hundreds of years, the British instead vigorously promoted its parliamentary democracy and its so-called progressive and civilized gentlemen. However, the so-called democracy of the British is nothing more than a product of the peace between capitalists and aristocrats. Only wealthy people have the right to vote and be elected. The voices of workers, farmers, and homeless people cannot be heard in the parliament at all. However, with the process of industrialization, the urban population has increased rapidly, and a new class has emerged, that is, the working class. The workers here are different from the handicraftsmen of the past. They often have no wealth, and will go hungry if they do not work for a day. What's more, poverty. At the same time, they are more organized and disciplined than farmers, and they are relatively centralized and easy to form organizations. In 1838, Britain's urban population had reached 48% of the total population. Industrialization and rapid urbanization caused conflicts between the poor and the rich to proliferate. In 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, spinning mill workers averaged 8 miles a day between machines. By 1838, workers averaged 24 miles a day. You may have no idea about 20 miles, which is 38.62 kilometers. During the same period, the Austrian army's marching speed was 20 kilometers per day, and its forced march was only 30 to 40 kilometers. By the way, people can die during forced marches. In other words, it is common for people to die from exhaustion during forced marches in this era. In addition, some people will definitely say that marching 120 kilometers in one day is not a normal situation. 99.999% of pure infantry armies at all times, and at home and abroad, cannot do it. At this time, the daily working hours are also unbearable. For ordinary people, the 12 to 14-hour work system, and the even more extreme 16-hour work system, there is nothing you dare not think about, and there is nothing they dare not do. As for the working environment, let alone places where death is inevitable, such as coal mines and brick factories, textile workshops are also torture like purgatory. In summer, the high temperature in a closed room can reach 70 degrees 80°C. It is common for workers to suffer from heat stroke. The workers who fell will most likely never stand up again, because most of the workers caught in the machinery will die immediately, and the remaining ones will die within a few months. If they still survive, there is a high probability that they will sent to the workhouse. The increase in work intensity and working hours did not lead to an increase in income. After the initial market dividend disappeared, factory owners began to squeeze their employees. In 1804, workers could receive 15 shillings per week, but by 1838, workers could only receive 15 shillings per week. Got 10 shillings. The more ruthless factory owners usually replace wages with physical goods, and these physical goods are usually not the best selling products, but some unsellable defective products. There are even mine owners who directly give ores that have no smelting value to miners to replace wages. The cost of smelting these ores has almost caught up with their own value, but all of this is legal in the UK. As for child labor, half of the workers in factories are often minors, because they are paid half the price of adults. Some factories recruit child workers and even directly provide them with 3 meals as bait. After the child workers accept the contract of 2 pence a day, they find that the so-called 3 meals are not as good as pig food, but a paste made of weeds, sawdust, and soil. The streets of London were crowded with people, and a team of ragged workers passed through London Bridge. The police and military police were dispatched, but there was still not enough manpower, because there were too many workers. Regarding the Workers' March in London, Palmerston advocated a complete suppression, and the Viscount of Melbourne also felt that the problem must be solved before the matter expanded. Even Iron Duke Wellington, who had been semi-retired for a long time, was found. Viscount Melbourne asked Duke Wellington to assemble his troops and suppress the workers' uprising when necessary. In order to prevent a vicious incident like that in Lyon, France, Viscount Melbourne had already prepared for the worst. He asked Palmerston to tell the Iron Duke Wellington, if workers initiate a riot, the cavalry must disperse the crowd as soon as possible. Palmerston, on the other hand, asked the Duke of Wellington to send troops to block the streets and prevent the workers from continuing to advance to the Palace of Westminster, where the House of Commons is located, at all costs, because once the workers reached the House of Commons, they would have a great international impact. Because Palmerston knew what those workers were up to, they demanded that the People's Charter be made into law. The People's Charter was a petition to Parliament, submitted by the London Working Men's Association in 1837. It proposed that men over the age of 21 should have universal suffrage, that electoral votes should be held secretly, that property qualification restrictions for parliamentary candidates should be abolished, and that Parliament should vote annually, hold a re-election, and distribute the constituencies equally. At this time, the People's Charter had been revised, but the target was still directed at those nobles and those who were unkind for their wealth. Some factory owners even said that if the 8-hour work system was implemented, he would rather move the factory to France and even change his nationality. The leader of the workers also had a treasonous petition, which read, "The Honorable House, as it is now constituted, is neither elected nor decided by the people. It only serves the interests of a few, and ignores the poverty, suffering, and aspirations of the majority." Queen Victoria earned £164, 17 shillings and 60 pence a day. Her husband Prince Albert earned £104, 20 shillings, while millions of working people earned only 2 or 3 pence a day each. Viscount Palmerston colluded with the Sassoon family to prepare Britain to fight for the opium traffickers, etc. The most frightening thing is that there are still 1.25 million signatures on this petition. At this time, the total population of the UK mainland, not counting the island of Ireland, is only 10 million. For Britain's sake, this petition must not be made public, and Palmerston did not hesitate to do so at any cost. Historically, although the Duke of Wellington's troops arrived at the Palace of Westminster before the parade, they did not implement the blockade order. The relationship was very complicated, and the soldiers were unwilling to shoot their own people, so the parade was allowed till the procession arrived at the Palace of Westminster. The parade has passed London Bridge, and is about to reach St. Margaret's Street in the Palace of Westminster. Preparing for the worst, Palmerston hired several tramps to mingle with the crowd and shoot when necessary to cause chaos once someone fired a gun in the parade. The army had to fight back, so that his plan, to conspire with the Sassoon family, to start a war would not be exposed, and he would still be the British Foreign Secretary. However, at this moment, the procession suddenly turned around, and went not to the Palace of Westminster, but to Buckingham Palace, where Queen Victoria lived. In fact, many Labour leaders are very puzzled by this decision. But William Lovett, the actual controller of the Workers' Association at this time and the moralist leader, insisted on doing so. William Lovett opened a letter, and inside was a letter from the mysterious man. This is the instruction of the mysterious man. Do you still doubt it? The mysterious man never misses it. Without him, we would have been caught in the gendarmerie. Several of the Labour leaders recognized the mysterious man's handwriting, but this time the mysterious man used Latin again, which many leaders could not understand. Fortunately, some of the Labour leaders had been priests and understood some Latin, so they could read it to everyone. The leaders of the British Workers' Association still admire this mysterious man very much, but this mysterious man writes in different languages every time, which is very difficult to read, and from time to time he will insert 1 or 2 sentences in German and French. Ahem. Cough. Cough. It seems I can't write more about this topic, so there will be no more updates today. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.